The desert wind carried with it the breath of forgotten centuries, rippling across the cliffs of Deir el-Bahari, as though the land itself whispered memories of a king whose name shaped the fate of Egypt. Long before the world spoke of Middle Kingdom splendor, before granite monuments glimmered under the sun in perfect harmony, there existed a time when Egypt groaned under the strain of division. It was into this fractured land that Mentuhotep, son of Intef III and heir to the Theban line, first opened his eyes. He was born into a kingdom split by rival powers, where lords of Heracleopolis claimed kingship in the north, while the Theban dynasty held fast to the south, each believing destiny favored them alone. That the young prince would one day reunite these two lands seemed at first nothing more than the hopeful murmur of priests who interpreted omens and saw the silhouette of future triumph in the curl of incense smoke. Mentuhotep grew beneath the towering cliffs of Thebes, where the Nile shimmered like a divine ribbon binding the realm to life. Even in childhood, he sensed the tension that lived like a shadow behind the elegant rituals of the palace. Messengers arrived breathless from the borders, carrying reports of skirmishes with Heracleopolitan allies, of villages unsure to whom they owed allegiance, of nomads who took advantage of the chaos. And yet, for all the apprehension that weighed upon the court, there was a quiet confidence among the Thebans that destiny rested upon their prince. The priests spoke of prophecies, of a king who would reunite the two lands and restore harmony to the cosmic order of Ma'at. Those words accompanied Mentuhotep as he learned to read the sacred scripts, as he learned the rhythm of the river and the cadence of command, and as he grew into a youth whose presence carried the gravity of a future far greater than himself. When his father died, Mentuhotep ascended the throne as a young man, adopting the throne name Nebhepeter, the Lord of the Rudder of Ra. The symbolism of the name did not escape him. He was to steer the sun god's course, guiding Egypt from darkness into renewed unity. Just as Ra steered his solar barque across the heavens, the weight of kingship settled upon him like a mantle woven from centuries of expectation. The court bowed, the banners unfurled, and the musicians played hymns of ascension. But beneath the celebration, the truth remained. He inherited a divided realm, with borders trembling under strain. From the beginning, he understood that words alone would not reunite Egypt. The Heracleopolitan rulers were entrenched, backed by allies who benefited from the fragmentation. The northern lords had built their own networks of power, their own temples, their own sense of legitimacy. If Egypt was to become whole again, he would need to win not just battles but hearts, those of soldiers, craftsmen, priests, and farmers who had grown accustomed to the uncertainty of divided rule. So Mentuhotep made Thebes not only his capital but the heart from which he would radiate influence across the land. He strengthened the regional governors who were loyal to him, honored the gods with festivals that revived ancient traditions, and expanded diplomatic ties with Nubia to secure the southern trade routes that supplied gold, incense, and exotic goods. Still, the conflict with Heracleopolis simmered. Raids flared along the border between the two spheres of influence. There were villages that shifted allegiance depending on whose army passed closest, and warlords who exploited both sides. Mentuhotep traveled along the contested zones, not merely as a king, but as a presence that inspired unity. He listened to the concerns of local elders, inspected irrigation canals, and offered sacrifices to temples abandoned amid the turmoil. People who had long felt ignored by distant rulers now found themselves addressed personally by the rising Theban king. In those early years, he also began laying foundations for a tomb unlike any Egypt had yet seen. Built against the cliffs at Deir el-Bahari, the site would be a monumental statement, not only of his divine authority, but of a new era dawning under his rule. The architects envisioned terraces carved from the living rock, colonnades stretching like ribs of a grand cosmic body, and courtyards that seemed to drink sunlight and breathe it back into the landscape. Every block lifted, every column raised, contributed to the image of a king determined to fuse the earth with the heavens. Laborers from across Theban territories flocked to the site, knowing that they were constructing not just a tomb, but a symbol of rebirth for Egypt itself. As tensions with the north grew sharper, Mentuhotep understood that the moment for decisive action approached. Through the country, the falcon standard of Thebes fluttered in desert winds, and soldiers drilled for campaigns that would test their endurance. Yet, before war erupted in full, Mentuhotep sought to strengthen the spiritual foundations of his rule. He ordered statues crafted of himself in diverse styles, sometimes as a youthful, idealized figure, other times as a divine being with black painted skin, symbolizing rebirth. These statues traveled to temples far and wide, their presence reinforcing the idea that Nebhepeter was more than a mortal king. He was the living Horus destined to restore unity. Among his advisors was a wise general named Keti, whose tactical brilliance and loyalty proved invaluable. Keti had seen generations of border skirmishes and believed that the conflict with Heracleopolis could end only with a decisive victory. Yet Mentuhotep hesitated for a time, not out of fear, but because he understood the immense cost civil war would demand. The fields along the Nile were fragile, easily disrupted by the march of armies. The people had already suffered through years of division. But each moon that passed brought new provocations from the north, new incursions, new insults to Theban authority. In time, the choice ceased to be his. Egypt cried out for resolution, and he alone had the strength to answer. The first major campaigns began in the 14th year of his reign. Mentuhotep rode at the head of his armies, clad in armor of hardened leather and bronze, the plumes of his crown swaying with each stride of his chariot horses. The banners of Thebes glinted under the sun, and priests marched beside them, chanting spells to shield the king from harm. As the columns advanced into contested lands, news of their approach reached villages miles ahead. Families gathered to watch the procession, some offering blessings, others fearful of what battles might follow. The Heracleopolitan forces, experienced and well-organized, met the Theban army in a series of violent clashes. The battles were desperate, fought across plains where dust clouds blotted out the horizon, where arrows hissed like angry serpents, where the cries of the wounded mingled with the thunder of chariots. Mentuhotep fought not merely as a commander issuing orders from afar, but as a presence felt on the front lines. Soldiers took heart when they glimpsed him, and many later swore they saw divine light flash around him in the heat of battle. During one brutal confrontation near Abydos, the fighting grew so intense that the sands turned dark with blood. Keti's strategies enabled the Theban troops to outflank their opponents, but the struggle came at a heavy price. Among the fallen were members of Mentuhotep's elite guard, the most loyal protectors of the throne. The king ordered that their bodies be retrieved and granted honorable burial. Later, in Thebes, a cemetery was established for the martyred warriors, their sacrifice immortalized in stone inscriptions. The loss weighed upon him, deepening his resolve to end the conflict so their deaths would not be in vain. Progress through the years of war was slow, marked by gains and setbacks. But with each campaign, Mentuhotep tightened his hold over the contested lands. The Heracleopolitan rulers grew weaker, worn down by the relentless pressure of Theban forces and the wavering loyalties of their subjects. As stability returned to regions reclaimed by Mentuhotep, he sent administrators to oversee irrigation repairs, temple restorations, and tax relief for villages ravaged by conflict. These policies made the people look upon him not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of balance. While the military campaigns continued, construction at Deir el-Bahri pressed forward. The terraces expanded, rising step by monumental step up the face of the cliffs. Colonnades lined with massive pillars stretched out like the arms of the king, embracing eternity. In the inner sanctums, painters decorated walls with scenes of divine rituals, celestial journeys, and military triumphs. Sculptors carved statues that stood sentinel along the walkways, some representing Mentuhotep in his serene divine aspect, others depicting him as a smiting king crushing the forces that threatened Egypt's unity. Workers toiled day and night, knowing that the king intended this site to represent the very essence of his reign renewal, power, and cosmic harmony. As the years passed, the climax of the war approached. Momentum swung decisively toward Thebes, and with a final campaign that shook the foundations of the northern realm, Mentuhotep broke the power of Heracleopolis. The victory was swift and overwhelming, a culmination of decades of strategy, sacrifice, and unwavering will. When the dust settled, Egypt, after so many generations of division, was whole again. And at the center of this new unity stood Mentuhotep II, the king who had done what none before him had achieved since the Old Kingdom. He restored the two lands under a single crown. With Egypt unified beneath the double crown, Mentuhotep moved swiftly to transform conquest into stability, for he understood that victory on the battlefield was only the beginning of a far greater challenge, turning a land long fractured by rivalries into a realm that breathed again as one body, one spirit, one destiny. The wounds of civil war ran deep, etched not only into the land, but into the fears and habits of its people, many of whom had known nothing but division for generations. For these Egyptians, the idea of a single king ruling both Upper and Lower Egypt felt almost mythical, a memory inherited from ancestors rather than a living truth. Mentuhotep felt the weight of that uncertainty as he traveled northward, inspecting the territories newly reclaimed under Theban authority. Villages watched his arrival with a cautious reverence, unsure whether the man who had conquered their former lords would rule with harshness or mercy. Instead of sweeping punishment, the king offered amnesty to many who had sworn loyalty to Heracleopolis. Recognizing that unity demanded reconciliation as much as strength, priests from northern temples were invited to join royal ceremonies. Craftsmen were commissioned for restoration projects, and noble families were given the chance to pledge themselves to the renewed crown rather than face exile. This policy won hearts more effectively than the most decisive victories, and gradually, the people of the north began to speak his names: Nebuchadnezzar, unifier, restorer, with the same devotion that had filled the voices of Thebans for decades. Administrators dispatched by Mentuhotep worked day and night to repair damaged irrigation systems, for he knew that a hungry populace could not admire their king's achievements, no matter how glorious. The Nile's rhythms were sacred, and its canals were lifelines that needed meticulous care. Surveyors measured embankments that had crumbled during the war. Engineers directed laborers who dredged silt that had accumulated for years, and scribes recorded every improvement with the precision expected of a state returning to order. As crops flourished once more in the rejuvenated fields, villages that had once teetered on the brink of abandonment revived with renewed optimism, and the people began to believe that the era of hardship was finally receding. Meanwhile, at Deir el-Bahri, Mentuhotep's monumental tomb complex evolved into a structure whose grandeur eclipsed anything Thebes had ever witnessed. The terraces expanded outward in geometric perfection, the colonnades grew taller, and the causeway connecting the valley floor to the cliffside temple took on an almost ceremonial aura. Architects debated over the symbolism of each design choice, for they knew the king did not seek a mere burial site, but a statement etched into eternity. The structure's fusion of rock-cut chambers and freestanding architecture was radical, signaling the beginning of a new aesthetic that would influence generations to come. Every block hauled into place, every sculpture shaped from limestone, every stretch of smooth plaster added to walls resonated with the conviction that Mentuhotep's reign represented rebirth. The artisans felt it as they worked, the sense that they were not constructing just a monument, but participating in the restoration of Egypt's cosmic harmony. The king himself visited the site often, walking among ramps and scaffolding with a gaze that never lingered on imperfections, but instead on possibilities. Workers would pause their tasks as he passed, bowing as deeply as their tired bodies allowed, and he responded with a nod that conveyed both gratitude and expectation. Mentuhotep was not a ruler who distanced himself from the labor of his people. He walked the dust-covered paths beside them, acknowledging the sweat and skill poured into the creation of his future resting place. Yet even in these moments of architectural triumph, he never allowed himself to forget the fragility of his hard-won unity. Word reached him of unrest along the northeastern borders, where desert nomads had begun raiding caravans in the power vacuum left by Heracleopolitan decline. Determined not to let instability rekindle chaos, he organized expeditions to secure the trade routes that connected Egypt to valuable goods from the Sinai and beyond. These campaigns were smaller in scale compared to the Civil War, but their impact was no less significant. Through swift tactical strikes and the establishment of fortified way stations, Mentuhotep's forces restored safety to the corridors of commerce, ensuring that the wealth flowing into Egypt would nourish its recovery. One of the most intricate challenges facing Mentuhotep was integrating the administrative systems of the formerly divided kingdoms. The northern bureaucracy, influenced by generations of Heracleopolitan rule, differed markedly from the Theban style. Scribes used slightly different conventions, tax records followed alternate cycles, and temple endowments varied in structure and priority. Instead of discarding one system in favor of the other, Mentuhotep chose to harmonize the two, merging practices to create a more adaptable, resilient administrative order. This required patient negotiations with temple authorities, noble houses, and regional overseers, each of whom feared losing influence in the transition. But the king's steady insistence on unity, supported by careful diplomacy, gradually brought them into alignment. Religious policy also required delicate attention. The Civil War had disrupted offerings to many temples, especially those aligned with Heracleopolitan patronage. Mentuhotep knew that divine favor was essential not only for legitimacy, but for the spiritual health of the nation. So he reinstated offerings to northern deities, repaired their sanctuaries, and even elevated certain cults that had been overshadowed during the conflict. Among these was the god Osiris, whose mythology of death and rebirth resonated deeply with a nation emerging from turmoil. The rise of Osiris worship across Egypt became intertwined with Mentuhotep's own image as a king who restored life to a fractured land. His personal devotion, however, remained anchored in Amun and Montu, the great gods of Thebes. Under his patronage, Amun's cult expanded significantly, laying the foundations for the god's future prominence in the centuries to come. Festivals honoring Amun grew in scale and grandeur, their rituals invoking the unity of Upper and Lower Egypt through symbols of cosmic order. The people attended in immense numbers, some traveling great distances to witness the processions that wound through Thebes like living rivers of devotion. Among the most devoted participants was a young priest named Hinanu, whose keen intellect and eloquent prayers soon caught the attention of higher-ranking clergy. Mentuhotep noticed the priest during a temple festival, impressed by the conviction with which he recited the ancient hymns. Over time, Hinanu became one of the king's trusted advisors in matters of ritual and theology, offering insights that helped Mentuhotep shape a religious vision capable of embracing the whole of Egypt once more. Yet, Mentuhotep's reign was not defined solely by internal reconstruction. To the south, Nubia had watched Egypt's civil war with a mixture of caution and opportunity. As Mentuhotep strengthened his control over the unified kingdom, he turned his gaze toward the southern frontier to secure the gold-rich resources and trade networks vital for Egypt's prosperity. Campaigns into Nubia were launched, not merely to assert dominance, but to ensure that Egypt's presence along the Nile's southern stretches remained unchallenged. Mentuhotep's forces built fortifications and re-established outposts abandoned during the years of division, sending a clear message that Egypt had returned to the world stage with renewed strength. The king's reputation spread beyond his borders as merchants carried news of his achievements to foreign courts. Tales of the Theban ruler who had ended decades of fragmentation reached lands far from the Nile's banks, inspiring both admiration and caution among neighboring kingdoms. Diplomats began arriving in Thebes, bearing gifts: cedar from Byblos, lapis lazuli from distant mines, incense from desert caravans, signs that Egypt's international relationships were stabilizing under its revitalized crown. As these developments unfolded, work on Deir el-Bahri approached completion. The terraces gleamed under the sun, the pillars stood with quiet majesty, and the inner chambers exuded a profound serenity. It was a complex that mirrored Mentuhotep's reign in every respect. Bold, yet harmonious. Innovative, yet rooted in tradition. Expansive, yet deeply connected to the Theban landscape. When the final stones were set and the sacred spaces consecrated, the king walked through the finished complex in silent contemplation. The shadows cast by the towering cliffs danced along the columns, and a warm breeze carried the scent of incense from a nearby shrine. Here, in this monumental union of stone and spirit, Mentuhotep felt the presence of eternity settling around him. He knew that one day this place would house his body, but he also sensed that his legacy had already begun to transcend mortality. Even so, he understood that the work of maintaining unity was never truly finished. Rivalries could resurface, borders could shift, generations could forget the cost of division. And so Mentuhotep resolved to spend the remainder of his reign reinforcing the foundations he had built, ensuring that future kings would inherit a nation strong enough to endure the challenges of time. That resolve shaped every decision he made as Egypt entered a new phase of flourishing under his steady hand, with the promise of a lasting Middle Kingdom rising like the sun over the deserts of Thebes. In the years that followed the consolidation of his rule, Mentuhotep expanded the reach of his authority with a subtlety that marked him not only as a conqueror, but as a statesman of uncommon foresight, for he recognized that lasting unity required more than military dominance. It demanded the weaving of a shared identity strong enough to transcend the memory of division. He therefore dedicated increasing attention to cultural integration, commissioning artisans, scribes, and architects from both Upper and Lower Egypt to collaborate on royal projects that celebrated a unified aesthetic. From Memphis to Thebes, workshops hummed with activity as stonecutters shaped limestone friezes depicting scenes of harmony. The Nile's twin banks embracing, papyrus and lotus intertwining, Horus and Seth reconciled in symbolic embrace. These images spread across the land like visual proclamations, reinforcing in the minds of the people the idea that unity was not merely political, but spiritual. Meanwhile, educational reforms took shape in scribal schools, where young students learned standardized writing conventions that blended Theban and Northern traditions. Master scribes oversaw the careful revision of administrative manuals, ensuring consistency in taxation, land assessment, and temple accounting. These measures strengthened the bureaucracy, allowing it to operate smoothly across the newly reunited realm. As these reforms took root, Mentuhotep also invested deeply in Egypt's economic infrastructure. He ordered the restoration of quarries that had fallen into disuse during the Civil War, and soon caravans began transporting newly hewn stone to construction sites across the kingdom, fueling an age of architectural revival. Copper mines in the Sinai reopened under stronger military protection, providing a steady supply of metal needed for tools and weapons. Trade expeditions ventured farther into the eastern deserts, seeking precious stones and rare minerals that artisans transformed into jewelry worthy of the royal court. These embellishments adorned not only members of the elite, but were offered to temples as votive gifts, strengthening the bond between king, gods, and people. The flourishing economy, however, did not distract Mentuhotep from the persistent threats that lingered at Egypt's borders. Reports of increased activity among Libyan tribes reached Thebes, prompting the king to dispatch scouts to assess the situation. Their findings confirmed his fears. The Libyans, emboldened by the instability that had plagued Egypt for decades, had begun probing the western frontiers. Determined to secure the long-neglected border, Mentuhotep organized a series of campaigns that combined diplomacy with decisive force. Envoys met with tribal leaders, offering trade agreements and safe passage in exchange for peace, while military patrols demonstrated Egypt's readiness to defend its lands. The strategy succeeded, and for the first time in generations, the western border enjoyed a period of relative calm. Even as he managed the shifting landscape of foreign relations, Mentuhotep continued to refine his role as the spiritual center of the kingdom. He introduced reforms to royal ceremonies, emphasizing the king's divine nature as the earthly embodiment of Horus. During festivals, He wore the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt with heightened symbolism, reminding the populace of the unity he embodied. Priests performed rituals in temples newly restored under his patronage, invoking the gods to bless the Middle Kingdom with stability and abundance. The increasing prominence of Amun in these rites reflected not only Mentuhotep's personal devotion, but also the growing influence of Thebes within the national religious hierarchy. This shift would have profound implications for future dynasties. But in Mentuhotep's time, it served primarily to consolidate Theban leadership within a pan-Egyptian framework. While temples flourished, attention also turned to improving the daily lives of common people. Mentuhotep ordered the construction and repair of granaries across the kingdom, creating strategic reserves of grain in case of famine. These granaries ensured food security, reducing the risk of uprisings fueled by hunger. Roads and canals underwent significant upgrades, facilitating the movement of goods and troops. Villages damaged during the Civil War received aid for reconstruction, and craftsmen traveled from Thebes to assist in rebuilding efforts, bringing with them skills that enriched local economies. It was during this period of revitalization that Mentuhotep initiated one of his most ambitious non-military projects: the establishment of a national system of desert way stations. These fortified outposts provided water, shelter, and supplies for travelers and trade caravans crossing Egypt's most perilous regions. Their presence reduced the dangers of desert travel, expanded commercial networks, and increased the kingdom's ability to monitor movement across its borders. Through these interconnected measures, Mentuhotep fostered not only unity, but resilience, a characteristic that would define the Middle Kingdom long after his death. Amid these triumphs, the king also faced personal challenges. The death of Queen Tem, one of his closest companions, cast a shadow over the court. Her passing was mourned deeply in Thebes, where she had been beloved for her grace and wisdom. Mentuhotep ordered that she be buried with honors befitting a queen, and a finely crafted statue was placed in her memory within the temple complex. The king's grief, though rarely expressed publicly, was evident to those closest to him in the solemn way he conducted rituals during that period. Yet even in mourning, he did not withdraw from his duties. Instead, he found renewed purpose in strengthening the institutions that would endure beyond any individual's lifetime. One of the most visionary aspects of his reign was the way he expanded the role of women within the royal household and temple hierarchy. Recognizing the influence spiritual women could exert, he appointed priestesses to high-ranking positions in the service of Hathor and other goddesses, granting them authority that reflected the renewed balance he sought to instill throughout the realm. Their presence in ceremonies underscored the symbolic unity between masculine and feminine divine forces, reinforcing the cosmic balance essential to Egypt's conception of order. As Mentuhotep entered the later years of his reign, his attention increasingly turned toward legacy. He began planning additional expansions to the Deir el-Bahri complex, envisioning new statues and reliefs that would immortalize his achievements. Artists carved colossal figures of the king in various forms, some as Osiris, symbolizing rebirth, others as Horus, signifying divine kingship, and still others in idealized human form, representing the living ruler who had restored Egypt's greatness. These statues were arranged throughout the complex in carefully considered alignments, reflecting astronomical patterns that connected the earthly monument to celestial cycles. One of the most extraordinary innovations in Mentuhotep's mortuary architecture was the development of a central ramp that connected the lower court to the upper terrace. Scholars would one day marvel at this feature, seeing in it the early blueprint for later temple designs that reached their pinnacle under the new kingdom. For the workers who constructed it, however, it represented both a monumental challenge and a testament to their mastery of engineering. The ramp stretched upward like a pathway between worlds, symbolic of the king's journey from the mortal realm to the divine. Within the inner chambers of the complex, inscriptions documented Mentuhotep's accomplishments in exquisite detail. They described his unification of Egypt, his campaigns in Nubia, his restoration of temples, and the prosperity that blossomed under his rule. These inscriptions were more than historical records, they were expressions of gratitude from a nation reborn. Scribes who carved them did so with reverence, aware that they were etching into stone the story of a king whose deeds would echo for millennia. As the monument neared completion, Mentuhotep participated in a series of elaborate ceremonies to consecrate the site. Priests clad in leopard skins performed purification rites. Incense curled upward in fragrant spirals, and hymns reverberated off the surrounding cliffs. In the largest courtyard, the king offered sacrifices to Amun, Montu, and Osiris, asking their blessing for the afterlife journey he would one day undertake. The cliffs themselves seemed to respond, their ancient surfaces glowing with golden light as the sun descended behind them. It was during one such ceremony that a powerful sandstorm descended unexpectedly upon the site. Workers scrambled for shelter as winds howled through the colonnades, but Mentuhotep stood firm, sheltered only by a handful of guards and priests. Though the storm was fierce, it passed quickly, leaving behind a profound silence that settled over the complex. Some interpreted the storm as a sign of divine acknowledgement, a powerful reminder that even the forces of nature recognized the significance of the king's work. Mentuhotep did not comment on the event, but those who observed him noted a quiet intensity in his expression afterward, as though he felt a deeper connection to the gods who governed Egypt's fate. In the latter part of his reign, Mentuhotep focused on ensuring a smooth succession. He elevated his son, the future Mentuhotep III, to prominent roles within the administration, allowing him to oversee construction projects and accompany the king on inspections. This not only trained the young prince in governance, but also demonstrated to the nation that the royal line remained strong and secure. Leaders from across Egypt acknowledged the heir with respect, recognizing that the continuity of Mentuhotep's dynasty would protect the unity they had come to cherish. As the seasons passed and the king advanced in age, his appearances became less frequent, but no less impactful. He continued to preside over major festivals and state ceremonies, his presence carrying the weight of decades of triumph. Even as his body grew frail, his voice retained the commanding resonance that had guided Egypt through civil war, reconstruction, and rebirth. The people looked upon him not merely as a ruler, but as the embodiment of the nation's resilience. His final years were marked by a serene dignity. Surrounded by loyal advisors, beloved family members, and the enduring symbols of his reign, Mentuhotep watched the Middle Kingdom flourish. Fields yielded abundant harvests, temples thrived with offerings, and trade routes buzzed with activity. For the first time in a century, Egypt stood whole, prosperous, and confident in its place in the world. When the end finally came, it was gentle. The king passed away in his palace at Thebes, attended by priests and family. His body was mummified with meticulous care and carried to the magnificent tomb he had built into the cliffs of Deir el-Bahri. The funeral procession stretched for miles, a river of mourners flowing toward the monument that symbolized his life's work. As his sarcophagus was placed within the sacred chamber, priests recited spells to guide his soul through the afterlife, and the people offered prayers of gratitude for the king who had restored their world. In the centuries that followed, Mentuhotep II's name would be remembered as the founder of the Middle Kingdom, the unifier of Egypt, the visionary whose reign marked a turning point in history. His tomb at Deir el-Bahri remained a testament to his greatness, its terraces and colonnades standing in eternal communion with the desert cliffs. And through the ages, the story of Nebuchadnezzar, the king who reunited Egypt, would be told and retold, echoing through the corridors of time as a symbol of strength, renewal, and destiny fulfilled. In the centuries after Mentuhotep II's death, his monumental legacy continued to radiate outward, shaping Egypt in ways even he might never have imagined. But at the moment of his burial, when the last hymns faded beneath the cliffs of Deir el-Bahri and the priests withdrew from the sealed chambers, the world felt as though it held its breath, suspended between grief and reverence. The people returned to their villages along the Nile, carrying with them stories whispered by elders who had lived through the king's unifying wars and by artisans who had carved his statues with hands trembling at the thought of shaping a god's visage. Though his body rested within stone corridors that descended into sacred silence, the pulse of his reign continued to beat within the land itself, woven into the new order he had painstakingly forged. During the early years of Mentuhotep III's rule, the stability his father had created allowed Egypt to thrive. The young king, having walked beside his father through the final stages of unification and reconstruction, inherited not a fractured kingdom, but one poised for expansion, innovation, and diplomatic strength. Yet even as Mentuhotep III assumed command of the throne, the presence of his father lingered everywhere in the architecture of Thebes, in administrative records that bore Nebuchadnezzar's seal, in temples where priests invoked the late king as an intercessor between mortals and gods. The younger king often visited Deir el-Bahri, where he stood before the towering terraces, imagining the weight of responsibility his father had borne during the long and painful years of reunification. These visits filled him with determination to preserve the unity Mentuhotep II had established. Meanwhile, the workers and foremen who had labored for decades on the tomb found themselves without the constant presence of the king who had walked among them, encouraging their efforts with a quiet strength. Many of them returned to ordinary lives in villages along the Nile, where they became living links in the chain of oral history. Through their recollections, generations to come would learn how Mentuhotep had personally inspected their progress, how he had spoken words of praise to exhausted crews at dusk, and how he had envisioned Deir el-Bahri as a monument not merely to his own life, but to the rebirth of Egypt itself. Some of these workers became teachers to apprentices in stone cutting and architecture, passing down the technical innovations they had mastered under royal supervision. As their students grew into skilled craftsmen and builders, they carried forward the aesthetic principles that had defined Mentuhotep's mortuary complex: harmony between constructed forms and natural landscapes, the integration of expansive terraces with sheer cliffs, and the seamless blending of ritual symbolism with monumental design. These principles would later culminate in the masterpieces of the 18th dynasty, but their roots reached back to the inspiration of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Across Egypt, nobles and officials who had served under Mentuhotep II felt compelled to continue his work by solidifying regional loyalty and administrative cohesion. Many oversaw projects to maintain canals, reinforce dams, and inspect farmlands to ensure stable crop yields. Others focused on temple restorations that had begun during the late king's rule, ensuring that no sanctuary remained neglected. Their actions were not merely practical, but symbolic. By preserving the structures that embodied Egypt's divine and cultural identity, they reaffirmed the unity that Mentuhotep had restored. In Thebes, the priesthood of Amun grew even more powerful, buoyed by the king's earlier reforms. Ritual processions became more elaborate, drawing worshippers from across the land. The god's oracles were consulted on matters of state, and his name was invoked in state documents, a testament to how deeply Mentuhotep had woven Theban spirituality into the national fabric. Yet the rise of Amun did not diminish the reverence for Mentuhotep II himself. Shrines dedicated to the late king emerged within temple precincts, where priests offered daily offerings to honor the dead ruler. These rituals portrayed him not merely as a deceased monarch, but as a semi-divine figure guiding Egypt's destiny from the afterlife. Over time, myths arose describing his celestial journey, depicting him sailing with Ra across the sky or standing in judgment beside Osiris in the Duat. These narratives blended historical memory with divine imagination, further cementing his status as one of Egypt's greatest unifiers. While Thebes flourished, the memory of the Heracleopolitan rulers faded into distant recollection. Their monuments crumbled, their names eroded from stone, overshadowed by the achievements of Mentuhotep II. Yet the unifier's policies had not sought to erase their legacy entirely. Instead, he had absorbed the most effective aspects of their governance into his own administration. This fusion created a bureaucratic lineage that endured throughout the Middle Kingdom, enabling later dynasties to rule with the efficiency and cohesion that had eluded Egypt during the first intermediate period. Meanwhile, in distant regions, Egypt's neighbors remembered Mentuhotep II as the king who had reasserted the Nile Valley's dominance. Trade resumed along long-neglected routes, with caravans carrying goods from Nubia, Punt, and the Levant. Foreign emissaries arrived in Thebes, bearing gifts and seeking alliances, recognizing that the unified Egypt forged by Nebuchadnezzar held an authority unmatched since the days of the Old Kingdom. Among these diplomatic achievements, the relationship with Nubia stood out as particularly influential. Though Mentuhotep's campaigns had asserted Egyptian control, subsequent rulers transformed this dominance into collaboration. Nubian chiefs were invited to Thebes as honored guests, exchanging gifts with Egyptian officials. In return, Egyptians were welcomed in Nubian settlements, where they traded, intermarried, and shared cultural traditions. This cross-cultural exchange enriched both regions, fostering mutual respect that persisted long after the political tides of the ancient world shifted. As the memory of civil war faded, stories of Mentuhotep's early years grew increasingly embellished. In taverns along the Nile, boatmen told tales of the young prince who had walked alone among the cliffs of Thebes, listening to the wind as though he heard the gods speak. Elders in desert villages recounted visions they claimed to have witnessed, asserting that a golden falcon had once flown above Thebes on the day of Mentuhotep's birth, a sign that Horus had chosen him. These stories, though far removed from historical fact, revealed the depth of admiration Egyptians held for the king who had restored their homeland. Children grew up hearing such tales, internalizing the moral lessons they conveyed: courage, resilience, justice, devotion to Ma'at. Through this oral tradition, Mentuhotep's legacy transcended the boundaries of time, shaping the values of future generations. In artistic workshops, sculptors sought to capture the essence of Mentuhotep's image even centuries after his death. They modeled statues of him not only after the canonical forms carved during his lifetime, but with stylistic variations that reflected evolving artistic tastes. Some depicted him with a serene, elongated face typical of Middle Kingdom aesthetics, while others emphasized his divine qualities with exaggerated features. Reliefs portrayed him offering incense to gods, smiting enemies, or presiding over ceremonies with regal poise. Many of these artworks adorned tombs and temples, ensuring that even in distant epochs, Egyptians would see his likeness and recognize the king who had ended the era of chaos. As time passed, Deir el-Bahri remained one of the most sacred sites in Egypt. Pilgrims traveled from far regions to leave offerings at its base, believing that the spirit of Nebhepetr dwelled within the terraces. Over generations, the site expanded as later kings and queens built their own monuments nearby, drawn to the spiritual power of the cliffs that had framed Mentuhotep's tomb. Most famously, Hatshepsut would one day commission her mortuary temple beside his, creating a harmonious dialogue between two rulers, separated by nearly 5 centuries, but united by the landscape that had witnessed their reigns. The echo of Mentuhotep's architectural vision shaped her masterpiece, demonstrating the enduring influence of his design principles. Yet even as Deir el-Bahri continued to flourish, time left its marks upon the land. Earthquakes cracked foundations, floods deposited layers of silt, and shifting sands slowly encroached upon once bustling courtyards. Still, the core of the monument, those immense terraces rising from the desert floor, stood resilient, as though protected by the spirit of the king they honored. Archaeologists thousands of years later would marvel at its preservation, piecing together the story of a ruler whose legacy had endured through an unbroken chain of human memory and devotion. Within the broader narrative of Egyptian history, Mentuhotep II emerged as a symbol of rebirth. Just as the Nile's inundation renewed the fields each year, his reign renewed the nation after decades of fragmentation. His policies provided the blueprint for the Middle Kingdom's golden age, marked by artistic flourishing, administrative sophistication, and cultural unity. Future kings measured their success against his achievements, seeking to emulate the harmony he had restored. Even the Hyksos, centuries later, when recounting the glories of the past, spoke with a mixture of awe and envy about the era Nebuchadnezzar had created, a time when Egypt had seemed invincible. As the Middle Kingdom reached its zenith, Mentuhotep's memory was woven into royal rituals. During coronation ceremonies, new kings recited prayers that referenced his unification of the two lands, invoking his name as a guardian who blessed their ascent to the throne. His deeds were inscribed in temple walls as moral exemplars, teaching future generations the responsibilities of leadership. On festival days, hymns recounted his victories, reminding the people that unity must be preserved with vigilance. Across the centuries, priests performed rites before images of the unifier king, calling upon his Ka to guide their rituals. His spirit, they believed, lingered over Egypt like a protective presence, ensuring that Ma'at would endure. In this way, Mentuhotep II became more than a historical figure. He became a timeless guardian of the nation he had rebuilt. And though the centuries brought new challenges, new dynasties, and new upheavals, the memory of the unifier remained a constant thread in the tapestry of Egypt's identity. His story lived not in the fragile scrolls of scribes alone, but in the hearts of the people who walked the valleys he had united, prayed in the temples he had restored, and admired the monuments he had left behind. Through them, through the continuity of culture and the resilience of memory, Mentuhotep II's legacy endured an eternal testament to the power of vision, strength, and unwavering devotion to the unity of the two lands. As the generations rolled onward, the stories of Mentuhotep II's unification matured into something even greater than collective memory. They became the very bedrock of Egypt's cultural and spiritual narrative, shaping how the people understood their past, their present, and their place within the cosmic order. In remote villages where the Nile curved like a dark blue serpent through fertile fields, grandmothers whispered tales of the king at dusk, their voices mingling with the hum of insects and the distant lowing of cattle. They spoke of a time when factions had torn Egypt apart, when nomarch fought nomarch and brother fought brother, and how the land itself had seemed to mourn. Then, they said, came Nebuchadnezzar, whose courage and determination restored harmony to the two lands, just as the gods had intended. These stories, though richly embroidered with poetic exaggeration, served as moral lessons, teaching each new generation the importance of unity, justice, and steadfast devotion to the principle of Ma'at. Meanwhile, priests in temple sanctuaries preserved a more formal narrative, inscribed upon papyri that outlined the theological significance of Mentuhotep's reign. They emphasized his role as Horus incarnate, a living manifestation of divine order, who had conquered the forces of chaos embodied by the civil war. In sacred rituals, they recounted his journey through battlefields and deserts as an allegory for the eternal struggle between light and darkness. This mythic framing elevated the historical king to the realm of cosmic symbolism, ensuring that his legacy would endure long after the memory of individual battles and campaigns faded from human recollection. Across Egypt, scribes incorporated references to Mentuhotep's deeds into instructional texts used to train new generations of administrators. These writings highlighted his innovations in governance, emphasizing how he had strengthened central authority without eradicating regional traditions. Students learned how he had balanced the powers of nomarchs, restructured taxation systems, and established new standards for judicial fairness. In this way, the unifier's administrative genius endured as a model for efficient governance, shaping the very bureaucratic frameworks that defined Middle Kingdom stability. At the same time, soldiers stationed at Egypt's borders heard tales of the king's bravery, recounted by veterans who had served in his campaigns. Around campfires beneath vast starry skies, they spoke of Mentuhotep standing at the front lines, rallying his troops with a determination that inspired unwavering loyalty. Young recruits listened in awe, imagining themselves following in the footsteps of the legendary warrior king. These stories cultivated a sense of pride and duty within the ranks, fostering a military tradition grounded in discipline and devotion to the land's unity. In the bustling markets of Thebes, merchants frequently invoked Mentuhotep's name when negotiating trade deals or recounting the renewal of commerce following the end of civil strife. They credited him with restoring safety to the roads and waterways, enabling goods to move freely once more. Every time a caravan arrived from Nubia laden with gold, ebony, and incense, or when ships docked carrying resins and exotic animals from Punt, The merchants were reminded of the stability that Nebuchadnezzar had created. His reign had reopened the doors of prosperity, and this prosperity, in turn, reinforced the people's gratitude for the unity he had achieved. Artists and musicians also played a role in preserving his memory. Poets composed epic verses describing Mentuhotep's triumphs, performed during festivals accompanied by lyres and flutes. These compositions swept across cities and villages alike, becoming beloved pieces of cultural art that transcended the constraints of time. Sculptors continued to craft images of the king, their hands guided by the aesthetic principles established during his reign. In workshops filled with the scent of fresh-cut stone and the echoing tap of chisels, apprentices studied the statues created centuries earlier, striving to capture the distinctive features that conveyed his authority and divine connection. Though artistic styles evolved, the core attributes associated with Mentuhotep II's strength, serenity, and divine legitimacy remained constant. As the centuries progressed, Egypt periodically encountered new challenges that tested the resilience of its unity. Yet in times of difficulty, the memory of Mentuhotep II served as a beacon of guidance. When famines struck or tensions arose between regions, officials invoked his name as a reminder that unity could be restored through wise leadership and devotion to Ma'at. When later kings faced rebellions or incursions, they looked to Nebuchadnezzar's military strategies as a blueprint for effective action. His example became a source of strength, a reminder that disorder could be overcome with courage and determination. In religious contexts, his mortuary cult continued to flourish. At Deir el-Bahri, priests performed rituals to honor his spirit, offering bread, beer, incense, and flowers at altars positioned within the deep recesses of the terraces. Pilgrims journeyed from distant nomes to leave personal offerings, amulets, carved figurines, or simple clay vessels inscribed with prayers. Many sought his intercession in matters of healing, fertility, or conflict resolution, believing that the unifier king retained great influence in the afterlife. The cliffs surrounding his tomb echoed with chants and hymns, creating an atmosphere of reverence that endured long after the fading of nearby settlements. Even as foreign powers rose and fell, as dynasties shifted and borders expanded or contracted, the core of Mentuhotep's legacy remained unshaken. During the New Kingdom, when Egypt reached unprecedented heights of power, rulers such as Hatshepsut and Thutmose III paid homage to his achievements. Hatshepsut's decision to construct her mortuary temple beside his was not merely architectural, it was a political and spiritual alignment with the king, whose reign had signified rebirth. Her terraces, ascending toward the sky like a series of monumental steps, echoed the design of Mentuhotep's complex, creating a dialogue between their reigns across the centuries. Thutmose III, the great warrior-pharaoh, studied accounts of Mentuhotep's campaigns as part of his military education, finding in them early examples of strategic brilliance. In the later eras of Egyptian history, when foreign rule occasionally overshadowed native dynasties, scholars and priests preserved Mentuhotep's story as a reminder of the strength inherent in Egyptian identity. During the Saite Renaissance, for example, when rulers sought to revive ancient traditions, they looked to Middle Kingdom models, including the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, as exemplars of cultural purity and political stability. Thus, his memory became not only a historical reference, but a symbol of national revival. As time pushed forward relentlessly, and as the sands of the desert slowly encroached upon monuments and temples, the story of Mentuhotep II continued to resist oblivion. Archaeologists in the modern age would one day uncover fragments of inscriptions, reliefs, and statues that had survived millennia of erosion. They marveled at the sophistication of his mortuary complex, recognizing its significance as a turning point in Egyptian architecture. They pieced together his achievements from the scattered remnants of ancient writings, reconstructing the life of a king who had once guided an entire civilization out of fragmentation and into unity. In the end, Mentuhotep II's legacy transcended the boundaries of the physical world. It lived in the myths told by grandmothers, in the rituals of priests, in the lessons of scribes, in the pride of soldiers, in the prosperity of merchants, in the art of sculptors, and in the aspirations of kings who followed in his footsteps. His story became inseparable from the story of Egypt itself, a narrative of renewal born from struggle, a testament to the enduring power of unity, and a celebration of the human capacity to rebuild, restore, and transcend. And so the Unifier King remained eternal, his spirit woven into the very fabric of Egyptian civilization, an everlasting guardian of the two lands. Over the sweeping arc of centuries that followed, the presence of Mentuhotep II seemed to permeate every corner of Egypt's cultural memory, not as a faint echo, but as a steady pulse, a reminder that unity was not merely a condition of governance, but a living force that required vigilance, wisdom, and reverence. In the far northern delta, where papyrus fields rustled in the wind and fishermen cast nets into marshy channels, villagers continued to recite poems about the king who had restored balance to the realm. They sang these verses during festivals and harvest gatherings, their voices rising in unison as offerings of grain and fruit were placed before small household shrines. Though simple in construction, these shrines held profound meaning. They were physical expressions of gratitude for the golden age of stability that Nebepeter had initiated, an age whose reverberations still guided the rhythms of their everyday lives. Along the riverbanks in Middle Egypt, where limestone cliffs rose in pale grandeur and nomarchal tombs overlooked the winding Nile, scribes chronicled the stories of their ancestors on long rolls of papyrus. Some of these writings told of distant conflicts resolved during the Unifier's reign, while others recounted the peaceful decades that followed. In temple archives, scribal students copied hymns written during the Middle Kingdom's flourishing, their reed pens gliding over freshly smoothed surfaces as they internalized the theological and historical narratives that linked their own lives to the legacy of the past. These students often paused to reflect on the significance of the texts they transcribed, aware that each stroke of ink played a small role in preserving the memory of a king whose influence had reshaped their world. In the south, near the First Cataract, where the Nile churned around granite boulders and where Egypt's boundary met the lands of Kush, sentries stood guard in fortified outposts that traced their origins back to Mentuhotep's campaigns. Here, the desert cliffs bore ancient carvings depicting the Unifier as a victorious warrior, smiting foes and expelling chaos. Although newer rulers had added their own inscriptions over time, the earliest images remained visible, their edges softened by centuries of wind yet unmistakable in form. Soldiers stationed in these garrisons often traced the outlines of these carvings with their fingertips, feeling connected to a lineage of warriors who had defended Egypt's borders since the dawn of its reunification. Even in distant Nubia, memories of Mentuhotep II lingered. Generations of Nubian chiefs recounted their encounters, sometimes peaceful, sometimes tense, with Egyptian envoys who traveled south in search of trade and diplomacy. These stories painted the Unifier not only as a conqueror, but as a stabilizing force whose reign had ushered in a new era of exchange between the two regions. Over time, elements of Egyptian art, language, and religion spread through Nubian societies, blending with local traditions to create an intricate tapestry of cultural interconnections. This exchange, though not always equal, reflected the profound impact of Egypt's renewed strength and unity during Nebhepeter's reign. Back in Thebes, the epicenter of Mentuhotep's legacy, the city continued to evolve into a towering symbol of divine kingship. The temples dedicated to Amun expanded over generations, their hypostyle halls, obelisks, and sacred lakes rising in grandeur as each new ruler sought to leave their mark. Yet even amidst the magnificence of later pharaohs, the presence of Mentuhotep II endured. His mortuary complex, though ancient by the time of the New Kingdom, still inspired awe among worshippers and builders alike. Pilgrims walked its terraces and stood before its colonnades, imagining the era when the Unifier had paced its corridors, overseeing the construction of a monument that would forever bridge the mortal and divine realms. High priests often visited Deir el-Bahri in quiet contemplation, offering incense and reciting passages from liturgies written centuries earlier. These rituals reaffirmed the sacred continuity between past and present, honoring the king who had not only rebuilt the political landscape, but had also revitalized the spiritual foundation of Thebes. Some priests claimed to experience visions within the silent chambers of the complex, describing ethereal encounters with the Ka of the unifier, who, they believed, continued to safeguard Egypt's destiny from his place among the gods. As archaeological and theological traditions intertwined, Mentuhotep's complex became a site of vast spiritual import. Oracle priests interpreted signs that appeared within its walls: cracks in stone, shifts of sunlight at dawn, the pattern of dust settling after ritual processions as messages sent from the unifier's spirit. These interpretations influenced decisions in state matters, guiding rulers and officials in times of uncertainty. Such reverence ensured that Nebuchadnezzar's name remained woven into the highest levels of political and religious discourse. During the late period, when Egypt faced pressures from foreign powers and internal instability, scholars and philosophers turned to historical texts for guidance. They studied accounts from the Middle Kingdom, analyzing the principles that had allowed Mentuhotep II to restore the two lands after a period of fragmentation. These thinkers debated the nature of leadership, the role of divine sanction, and the responsibilities of rulers to maintain Ma'at. Their discussions often cast the unifier as the ideal monarch, firm, yet just, powerful, yet pious, decisive, yet compassionate. These debates influenced reforms and social philosophies, shaping the intellectual landscape of the time. Even as new conquerors arrived, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, the memory of Mentuhotep II persisted. Foreign rulers who sought legitimacy within Egypt's ancient traditions learned of his achievements through temple inscriptions and priestly recitations. Some adopted elements of Middle Kingdom iconography to align themselves with Egypt's revered past, hoping to harness the cultural strength associated with Nebuchadnezzar's legacy. They realized that to rule Egypt effectively, one had to honor the lineage of great unifiers, chief among whom stood Mentuhotep II. In the libraries of Alexandria, scholars from diverse backgrounds delved into the ancient documents preserved from earlier dynasties. They discussed the unifier's tomb, his architecture, his battles, and the artistic innovations of his reign. Though separated from Mentuhotep II by nearly 2,000 years, these intellectuals felt the weight of his legacy as they studied the evolution of Egyptian statecraft and theology. Some even proposed philosophical treatises inspired by the cycles of chaos and restoration that defined his era, drawing parallels to the larger patterns of human civilization. Meanwhile, travelers journeying through the Theban necropolis during the Roman era recorded impressions of the immense mortuary complex built by the unifier. Though partially eroded and weathered by the relentless forces of time, the structure's terraces still rose with commanding presence against the stark desert cliffs. Roman writers described the sense of awe they felt while exploring the ancient site, noting that its architecture embodied a harmony between nature and human design, unmatched anywhere else in the world. These travelers inscribed graffiti upon the stone surfaces, marking their own fleeting moments within a monument that had already endured nearly 3 millennia. Over time, however, periods of decline took their toll. Shifting sands buried portions of the complex, while earthquakes caused some sections to collapse. The once brilliant pigments that adorned statues and reliefs faded, leaving behind muted traces of their former glory. Yet even in ruin, the site exuded an undeniable aura of power. Locals continued to regard the area as sacred, believing that the spirits of ancient kings wandered through the cliffs at night. They told tales of ghostly processions emerging from the shadows, reenacting ceremonies long vanished from living memory. These stories, though tinged with superstition, reflected a profound cultural truth. Mentuhotep II's legacy had become inseparable from the land itself. His reign was no longer simply a chapter in history. It was a foundational myth that shaped the identity of countless generations. When archaeologists in the modern age rediscovered his mortuary complex, they were struck by its monumental scale and symbolic complexity. As excavation progressed, they uncovered statues that conveyed an unprecedented blend of artistic realism and divine representation. They unearthed inscriptions that chronicled his unification of the two lands, revealing the political and spiritual significance of his reign. They analyzed architectural elements that demonstrated the transition from Old Kingdom traditions to innovative Middle Kingdom styles. These discoveries reshaped scholarly understanding of early Middle Kingdom history, elevating Mentuhotep II to his rightful place as one of Egypt's greatest rulers. Yet beyond academic circles, his story resonated with people around the world. Documentaries, books, and museum exhibitions introduced the public to the Unifier King, who had restored a fractured nation. Artists drew inspiration from his achievements, creating modern interpretations of his image. Visitors to Egypt stood in awe before the remaining terraces of Deir el-Bahri, imagining the time when the Unifier himself had gazed across the valley, envisioning a future in which Egypt would rise from chaos into unparalleled unity and strength. Through these ongoing encounters with his legacy, Mentuhotep II lived on not merely as an ancient figure preserved through archaeology, but as a timeless symbol of perseverance, renewal, and the power of visionary leadership. His story continued to inspire those who sought to understand the human capacity for rebuilding in the face of adversity, reminding them that even in the darkest chapters of history, the seeds of unity and rebirth await those bold enough to nurture them. Even as the modern world advanced with technologies and discoveries unimaginable to the ancient scribes who once chronicled Egypt's history, the story of Mentuhotep II maintained a magnetic pull on the imaginations of scholars, adventurers, and ordinary people alike. His legacy occupied a unique space, bridging the divide between myth and historical certainty, standing at the crossroads of archaeology, anthropology, spirituality, and narrative tradition. Every new excavation, every deciphered fragment of text, and every reinterpreted artifact seemed to unveil fresh layers of meaning, revealing that the Unifier's influence extended far beyond the narrow confines of his own epoch. Deep within archives across the world, researchers pored over brittle papyri that referenced the rituals performed during his reign. These records contained hymns, legal decrees, tax documents, and liturgical sequences that provided glimpses into the daily functioning of the reborn state he had created. Scholars marveled at the administrative sophistication evident in these texts, noting how Mentuhotep II's reforms had introduced new levels of organization, centralization, and standardization. This bureaucratic structure allowed Egypt not only to flourish in his lifetime, but to sustain a golden age that lasted for centuries thereafter. In museum galleries, visitors examined statues recovered from Deir el-Bahri and other sites associated with Nebhepetra. Many of these sculptures portrayed him in the black-skinned form of Osiris, a representation that symbolized rebirth and eternal life. Observers lingered in front of these statues, studying the serene yet commanding expression carved into the king's features. Though separated by thousands of years from the artisans who shaped the stone, they felt an intimate connection with the ancient world through these enduring works of art. Children pressed their hands against glass cases containing fragments of reliefs, asking questions about the man who had inspired such reverence. Their curiosity echoed the awe felt by Egyptians of the Middle Kingdom, whose own children had grown up hearing tales of the Unifier's courage. Anthropologists studying the evolution of Egyptian identity noted that Mentuhotep II's reign marked a pivotal moment in the formation of a cultural consciousness defined by resilience, adaptability, and reverence for tradition. They traced how the unified state he forged became a template for later societies, demonstrating how political centralization and religious legitimacy could combine to create a lasting national identity. These scholars argued that the Middle Kingdom, shaped in Mentuhotep's image, represented a renaissance of cultural unity that profoundly influenced the development of subsequent dynasties. Meanwhile, Egyptologists debated the finer details of his life, his policies, and the precise chronology of his military campaigns. Each artifact recovered from his tomb or administrative centers generated new theories and interpretations. Some researchers focused on the architectural innovations of his mortuary complex, analyzing how its terraces, colonnades, and processional pathways represented a dramatic departure from earlier funerary traditions. Others examined the theological shifts that occurred during his reign, exploring how his elevation of Thebes and its patron deity Amun altered the spiritual landscape of Egypt. These discussions, though sometimes contentious, reflected the enduring fascination with a ruler whose actions had reshaped the trajectory of an entire civilization. In the deserts around Thebes, archaeologists continued to uncover remnants of settlements that flourished during Mentuhotep II's era. These discoveries revealed the logistical infrastructure required to support massive construction projects, including workers' villages, storage facilities, and resource distribution networks. Excavations brought to light pottery shards, tools, and personal items that offered glimpses into the daily lives of the laborers who had built the unifier's monumental tomb. Through these artifacts, modern researchers reconstructed the social dynamics of the ancient workforce, gaining insight into the complex organization that underpinned one of the most ambitious architectural endeavors of the Middle Kingdom. Far from the archaeological sites, in classrooms across the world, teachers introduced students to the story of Mentuhotep II as part of lessons on ancient history. They described how Egypt, fractured by internal conflict, had been restored by a visionary king whose ambitious projects symbolized the rebirth of a nation. Students listened with fascination as they learned about the political challenges he faced, the battles he fought, and the monuments he built. Many felt inspired by his example, seeing in his story a blueprint for leadership grounded in perseverance and a deep commitment to unity. In communities descended from ancient Egyptians, whether in Egypt itself or abroad, Mentuhotep II remained a figure of pride. Artists created modern reinterpretations of his likeness, blending ancient motifs with contemporary styles. Writers drew upon his life as inspiration for novels, films, and poems that explored universal themes of conflict, reconciliation, and renewal. Musicians composed pieces inspired by the rhythms of ancient hymns, infusing them with modern instrumentation to create haunting evocations of the unifier's spiritual aura. These creative expressions demonstrated that Mentuhotep's legacy was not confined to academic study. It lived vibrantly in the cultural imagination. Meanwhile, in Thebes now, Luxor, the ancient cliffs that had once echoed with the chants of priests, continued to draw visitors from around the world. Travelers walked the paths that wound between the towering monuments, feeling the weight of history pressing gently upon their shoulders. Standing before the remains of Mentuhotep's mortuary complex, they contemplated the man whose vision had transformed not only the landscape, but the destiny of a civilization. Guides told enthralling stories about his reign, describing how the unifier had blended old traditions with new innovations, creating an architectural style that would influence Egyptian construction for centuries. They pointed out the unique features of the temple, highlighting the bold design choices that set it apart from earlier Old Kingdom pyramids. As tourists explored these ancient sites, many felt a sense of humility and wonder. They imagined the unifier surveying the cliffs, envisioning the grand complex that would one day rise from the desert floor. They imagined the thousands of workers who had carved stone blocks, transported materials, and assembled the structure with astonishing precision. They imagined the rituals that had once filled the air with incense and chanting, honoring a king whose legacy would outlive empires and epochs. Beyond the public sphere, Mentuhotep II's influence extended into the realm of personal reflection and philosophical thought. For many, his story offered a meditation on the nature of leadership, the idea that true strength lies not merely in power, but in the ability to restore harmony. His perseverance during years of conflict and uncertainty served as a reminder that unity is a fragile yet vital force requiring constant nurturing. His devotion to Ma'at illustrated the importance of balancing authority with justice, ambition with humility, and tradition with innovation. In this way, Mentuhotep's life transcended its historical context, offering wisdom relevant to societies far removed from ancient Egypt. Meanwhile, in academic institutions, Historians collaborated with experts in digital reconstruction to create virtual models of Mentuhotep's mortuary complex. Using advanced imaging technologies, they recreated the temple as it appeared in its prime, complete with vibrant colors, soaring colonnades, and meticulously carved reliefs. These digital reconstructions allowed people around the world to experience the grandeur of the complex without traveling to Egypt. They walked through virtual corridors, gazed upon reconstructed statues, and appreciated the structure's precise alignment with the surrounding cliffs. Through these digital experiences, Mentuhotep II's architectural vision found new life in the modern era, reaching audiences who might otherwise never have encountered the splendor of his achievements. Scholars analyzing the broader impact of Mentuhotep's reign argued that his unification of Egypt set the stage for the development of Middle Kingdom literature, a period that produced some of the most enduring works of ancient poetry, wisdom literature, and narrative storytelling. They traced thematic threads in these texts that reflected the values embodied by Nebuchadnezzar's rule, including the celebration of justice, the condemnation of chaos, and the aspiration toward moral integrity. Works such as the Instructions of Amenemhat and the Tale of Sinuhe, though written after Mentuhotep II's death, echoed the cultural renewal he had initiated. As humanity progressed into the digital age, where information flowed across global networks and knowledge expanded at unprecedented rates, Mentuhotep II's legacy continued to claim a place within the collective human consciousness. Documentaries reached millions of viewers, introducing new generations to the unifier's story. Online archives made ancient texts accessible to anyone with an internet connection. Enthusiasts formed communities dedicated to studying Egyptian history, exchanging insights and interpretations about the life of the king who had shaped the Middle Kingdom. Through these global interactions, the legacy of Nebuchadnezzar remained vibrant, a living dialogue between past and present. In the end, the story of Mentuhotep II endured because it spoke not only to the specific historical moment in which he lived, but to universal themes that resonated across cultures and eras. His vision of a united Egypt, his commitment to restoring order after a period of fragmentation, and his profound sense of duty toward his people reflected values that transcended time. His tomb, though weathered by millennia, continued to stand as a testament to his enduring spirit. His name, inscribed on ancient walls and whispered through generations of storytellers, survived as a symbol of rebirth, strength, and the indomitable human capacity to rebuild. And so Mentuhotep II lived on, not merely in stone or ink, but in the hearts of those who found inspiration in his legacy. Through stories, rituals, scholarship, and imagination, the unifier continued to guide, to inspire, and to remind humanity that even in the darkest hours of history, unity and renewal remain possible. Across the shifting centuries that followed, the myth of Mentuhotep II continued to evolve as Egypt itself transformed, shaped by new rulers, new threats, and new cultural influences that pressed upon the edges of the two lands, like the slow but relentless push of desert dunes. In the delta, where papyrus swayed in dense marshes and fishermen cast nets into shallow waters shimmering with sunlight, storytellers recited variants of his legend that had taken on a distinctly northern flavor. In their versions, Mentuhotep journeyed through mist-covered river channels, dispelling chaos-laden spirits who sought to divide Egypt with illusions and lies. These embellishments, though not historically grounded, reflected the deep need of the people to reinterpret the unifier king's story in ways that resonated with their immediate environment, weaving the universal theme of restored order into the landscape of their daily lives. Meanwhile, in the highlands of the eastern desert, nomadic tribes passed down a harsher, more austere version of the tale. Around campfires burning bright against the cold night winds, they described Mentuhotep as a relentless hunter of disorder, a king who crossed the bleak copper-gray mountains with only a handful of loyal followers, confronting treachery and rebellion in places where even the skilled desert trackers hesitated to travel. In these stories, he outwitted enemies by reading the desert's subtle signs: wind-shaped dunes, faint animal tracks, the distant cry of a falcon. Though mythologized, the echoes of his real military expeditions into those very regions lent the narratives an air of authenticity that strengthened their endurance across generations. In the southern provinces near Elephantine, where Nubia lay just beyond the rushing currents of the First Cataract, Mentuhotep's image took on a more diplomatic hue. There, elders spoke of his wisdom in balancing military strength with respect for neighboring cultures. In these retellings, he forged bonds through ritual exchanges of gifts, through shared oaths sworn upon the sacred waters of Khnum's temple. While his campaigns into Nubia were indeed recorded as forceful assertions of Egyptian authority, the myths softened the edges, casting him as a steward of balance who recognized the value of harmony with Egypt's southern neighbors. Thus, through diversity of interpretation, the king's legacy adapted to the cultural identities of each region, ensuring that his memory never grew stale or distant. In academic centers during the Middle and New Kingdoms, scribes and scholars meticulously studied the various versions of Mentuhotep's tale, comparing them with historical records preserved on temple walls and fragmented papyri. Their analyses were more than simple exercises in documentation. They represented a profound desire to understand the relationship between memory and truth. Students debated the symbolism embedded in different versions, questioning how mythic elements interacted with reality. For them, Mentuhotep II was not only a political figure, but also a philosophical lens through which to examine the cycles of decline and renewal that defined human history. These intellectual explorations gave rise to scholarly treatises, some of which endured for countless generations, forming the backbone of Egypt's historiographical tradition. In distant oases, such as Karga and Dakhla, where isolation bred unique variations of Egyptian culture, caravans brought traders and travelers who recounted Mentuhotep's exploits. The inhabitants of these remote settlements adapted the tales to better reflect their world, portraying him as a protector who ensured the safe passage of caravans across treacherous desert routes. They added elements of magical realism, divine storms that shielded him from enemies, sacred desert animals that guided him to hidden springs. These flourishes served not to distort the king's memory, but to celebrate his role as a figure of guidance amid a landscape where survival often depended on the mercy of the unseen. Over time, the legends formed a mosaic of interpretations, each piece colored by geography, culture, and collective need. But throughout these variations, one constant remained. Mentuhotep II symbolized unity, stability, and the triumph of Ma'at over confusion. This constancy granted his legacy a resilience that persisted even as Egypt's political landscape shifted drastically across dynastic cycles. When the Hyksos later seized control of the Delta, establishing their power centers in the northern regions and disrupting traditional Egyptian authority, the tales of Mentuhotep II took on renewed significance. In the south, where resistance simmered, his story became a rallying cry for independence. Families would gather in the evenings and tell their children how Nebuchadnezzar had once reclaimed a fragmented land from internal strife. Priests in Theban temples emphasized his victories, drawing parallels between the past era of unification and the hoped-for restoration of native rule. This reinterpretation of the ancient king as a symbol of resilience against foreign rule strengthened the resolve of those who later rose to repel the Hyksos dominion. During the brilliant ascendancy of the New Kingdom, when Egypt extended its influence far beyond the boundaries known in Mentuhotep's day, the legacy of the unifier continued to inform state ideology. Pharaohs engaged in territorial expansion often framed their achievements in relation to his foundational role in re-establishing Egyptian unity. Priests updated hymns to emphasize the continuity between his restoration of order and the empire building that characterized the 18th dynasty. The kings of this period frequently commissioned inscriptions linking their authority to his precedent, particularly when emphasizing legitimacy in times of succession or when consolidating administrative reforms. These textual commemorations functioned as political tools, anchoring their power in the memory of a monarch whose reign had once healed Egypt's deepest wounds. As the centuries drifted onward into the late period, when foreign powers such as the Persians, Libyans, and Kushites intermittently ruled over Egypt, Mentuhotep's significance only grew. His narrative served as a touchstone for cultural identity, a reminder of the unique strength that had once unified the two lands. Temples under foreign administration still maintained his cult in respect for its enduring societal value. Even foreign rulers occasionally invoked his example to legitimize their reigns, aligning themselves with the imagery of stability symbolized by the ancient king. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt and established the Ptolemaic dynasty, Greek scholars fascinated by the depth of Egyptian history studied Mentuhotep's accomplishments with genuine admiration, integrating references to him into their own hybrid scholarly traditions. In the Ptolemaic period, priests of the House of Life began cataloging ancient kings in long chronological lists written on papyri, now lost to time. Mentuhotep II consistently appeared as a crucial figure, marking the transition between chaos and renewed unity, his name encircled by reverential commentary. Despite being separated from the Middle Kingdom by well over 1,000 years, his reign remained one of the anchor points of historical continuity in Egyptian consciousness. This sustained reverence was not merely a result of his political achievements, but of the cultural, architectural, and religious innovations that had established entirely new phases of Egyptian civilization. His mortuary complex, though weathered by time, still commanded awe from pilgrims and architects alike. Even the Romans, upon assuming control of Egypt, continued to marvel at the terraces carved into the Theban cliffs. Travelers recorded their impressions of the site, describing it as a wonder of ancient workmanship that seemed to emerge seamlessly from the mountain itself. They noted how the temple's alignments interacted with sunlight, shadow, and seasonal shifts, hinting at a deep astronomical sophistication that impressed even cultures renowned for their engineering prowess. Though they did not worship Mentuhotep as the Egyptians had, they respected the enduring power of his architectural legacy. However, time showed no mercy even to monuments of such grandeur. Earthquakes, fractured pillars, winds carried sand into the once magnificent courtyards, and political instability caused the abandonment of priestly orders tasked with maintaining rituals for the king's spirit. The desert crept slowly inward, covering reliefs and sealing corridors beneath layers of dust. Yet even as the physical site decayed, the memory of Mentuhotep remained alive in the hearts of Egyptians, preserved through oral tradition long after the ancient priesthoods dissolved. When centuries later, explorers and scholars of the modern world journeyed into the Valley of the Kings and the surrounding cliffs, they uncovered remnants of Mentuhotep II's complex with immense excitement. Archaeologists, brushing away sand and debris, found inscriptions and statues whose craftsmanship testified to a period of rebirth and transition in Egyptian art. They pieced together fragments of painted reliefs and reconstructed pillars that offered glimpses into the ideological sophistication of the Middle Kingdom. Scholars realized that Mentuhotep's reign had not only reunited Egypt politically, but had also fundamentally reshaped its artistic and architectural identity. The discovery of mummified remains near the complex fueled debates about whether the king himself had been found, a topic that inspired decades of research and renewed public fascination. Modern Egyptologists examined funerary items, inscriptions, and stratified layers of construction, reconstructing the phases of the temple's expansion and identifying traces of rituals once performed to honor the king. Their work revived global interest in Mentuhotep II, transforming him from a figure known primarily to specialists into a widely recognized symbol of unity, resilience, and cultural revival. In classrooms across the world, students learned of his role in ending the First Intermediate Period, marveling at the way one ruler could alter the trajectory of an entire civilization. Books, documentaries, and museum exhibits revived his story for new generations, ensuring that his legacy would continue to inspire long after the physical remnants of his reign faded into dust. Yet beyond all academic interpretation and archaeological discovery, the essence of Mentuhotep II's legacy lived most vividly in the imaginations of those who heard it as a human story. a tale of a leader who rose from a city overlooked in earlier dynasties, who refused to accept division as the fate of his people, who fought not for personal glory but to restore wholeness to a land he believed was destined for unity. His journey from the uncertainty of civil war to the triumph of reunification spoke to universal themes that transcended the boundaries of time and culture. And so the story continued to be told not only by Egyptians, not only by historians, but by all who found meaning in the age-old struggle between fragmentation and harmony, chaos and order, despair and renewed hope. In this way, Mentuhotep II's spirit endured as more than a historical figure or mythic hero. He became a symbol of the eternal human aspiration toward unity, stability, and the restoration of what has been broken. And as long as tales of courage and renewal are shared beneath the stars or within the walls of learning, the memory of the king who reunited Egypt will live on, carried forward by voices that refuse to let his legacy fade. As the modern era unfolded and the science of archaeology matured into a discipline grounded in methodical excavation, rigorous documentation, and cross-cultural analysis, Mentuhotep II's legacy entered yet another stage of evolution, this time shaped by researchers equipped with tools and techniques unimaginable to the ancient scribes who once recorded the deeds of kings. The desert, long a protective veil, began to reveal its secrets more willingly. With each new discovery, another thread of the unifier's story emerged, guiding historians toward a fuller picture of the man behind the monumental achievements. Scholars studying his reign sought not only to recount the events, but to understand the complexities of a leader who navigated a fractured land and ushered in a new age. In university lecture halls far from the Nile's banks, students learned to read the hieroglyphs carved into Theban cliffs, allowing them to engage directly with texts composed during the king's lifetime. These inscriptions, although often idealized, offered insight into the nature of Mentuhotep's rule, his administrative reforms, his religious policies, his strategies for re-establishing central authority. Parallel studies delved into the socio-economic conditions of the First Intermediate Period, illuminating the challenges he faced as he sought to rebuild a nation whose infrastructure, political unity, and spiritual coherence had been eroded by decades of conflict. Excavations at Deir el-Bahri revealed increasingly detailed aspects of his mortuary complex. Archaeologists documented subtle architectural features that suggested the temple had been expanded in phases, each corresponding to shifts in political and religious ideology during his reign. They noted the evolution of artistic style within the reliefs, showing a transition from the old forms of the late Old Kingdom to the emerging conventions of the Middle Kingdom. This stylistic shift offered scholars a window into the aesthetic transformation taking place across Egyptian society as the country stabilized and creativity flourished once more. In laboratories, scientists examined pigments scraped from crumbled reliefs, uncovering the chemical composition of paints used nearly 4,000 years earlier. The vibrant red ochre that once colored the bodies of male figures, the deep blues that symbolized divinity, the gold flecks used to highlight sacred objects. All these details provided new dimensions to the understanding of the era's artistic practices. Meanwhile, forensic analyses of skeletal remains found in the surrounding necropolis revealed the harsh realities faced by the soldiers who fought in the wars of unification. Many bore the marks of violent conflict, broken bones, healed injuries, and evidence of strenuous labor. These findings humanized the narrative, reminding modern observers that the reunification of Egypt was not achieved through mythic heroism alone, but through the sacrifices of countless individuals whose names had long been forgotten. In museums, curators carefully displayed artifacts linked to Mentuhotep's reign. Clay figurines of servants meant to accompany the king in the afterlife, fragments of linen that once wrapped offerings, stelae inscribed with prayers, invoking the king's spirit. These objects, though small and humble compared to grand architecture, possessed an intimate power. They brought the era to life in ways that monumental constructions could not, offering glimpses into the everyday beliefs and practices of the people who lived under the unifier's rule. Visitors gazed upon these items with wonder, contemplating the vast stretch of time that separated them from the ancient artisans who created them. As public interest in ancient Egypt grew, authors, filmmakers, and artists began to reimagine Mentuhotep's story in new forms: novels, documentaries, visual art, and even interactive media. These creative retellings, though often dramatized, introduced wider audiences to the significance of his accomplishments. They presented him not only as a distant figure carved in stone, but as a complex individual navigating political turmoil, personal loss, and the immense responsibility of leading a nation out of darkness. Such portrayals, though speculative in parts, contributed to a more nuanced cultural understanding of the king's legacy, blending historical rigor with imaginative empathy. Across the world, Egyptologists convened at conferences to discuss new findings, debating interpretations of inscriptions, architectural alignments, and ritual practices associated with the king. These scholarly exchanges pushed the boundaries of knowledge, refining theories and challenging assumptions. Some proposed new models of governance for the early Middle Kingdom, suggesting that Mentuhotep had implemented a semi-feudal system to gradually re-establish royal authority. Others argued that his religious reforms laid the foundation for the more centralized theology that would emerge in later centuries. The intellectual dialogue surrounding his reign continued to expand, illustrating the inexhaustible richness of the subject. Through all these modern reinterpretations, one element remained constant: the recognition of Mentuhotep II as a pivotal figure in Egyptian history. His reunification of the two lands marked not only the end of political fragmentation, but the beginning of a cultural renaissance that defined the Middle Kingdom, an era often celebrated as one of Egypt's most refined and introspective periods. The literature, art, and statecraft of this epoch carried echoes of his influence, reflecting a society seeking to balance tradition with innovation, continuity with change. In Egypt itself, modern citizens living in the shadow of ancient monuments developed a renewed appreciation for Mentuhotep's contributions. Guides in Luxor, leading visitors through the terraces of Deir el-Bahri, spoke with pride of the king, who had restored unity to their ancestors' land. Schoolchildren learned his name alongside those of other great rulers, understanding that his actions had shaped the foundation upon which many later achievements were built. Tourism brought economic opportunities to communities near his temple, linking the modern livelihood of these regions to the enduring legacy of the ancient king whose reign had once revitalized Thebes. The landscape around his mortuary complex changed over time as restoration efforts sought to preserve the site from further erosion. Stone conservators carefully reinforced crumbling walls, ensuring that future generations could continue to walk the same pathways once traversed by priests performing rituals for the deceased king. Archaeological teams mapped the site using advanced technologies, ground sensors, photogrammetry, and 3D modeling to create digital reconstructions that captured the grandeur of the complex as it might have appeared in antiquity. These virtual models allowed scholars and the public alike to explore the site from afar, bridging temporal and spatial divides that had once limited access to such wonders. As advancements in technology continued, researchers soon applied genetic sequencing to mummies believed to be connected to Mentuhotep's lineage, seeking to trace family relationships and uncover health conditions that may have influenced dynastic transitions. Though the question of whether the king's own remains had definitively been found remained a topic of debate, the analyses nonetheless shed light on the broader familial networks that shaped Middle Kingdom politics. Such studies transformed the ancient narrative into something more tangible, connecting the modern world to the distant past at the molecular level. Yet, despite all the scientific breakthroughs and academic achievements, perhaps the most profound aspect of Mentuhotep II's legacy lay in the enduring human response to his story. People were drawn to his narrative not simply because he was a king or because he built impressive structures, but because his life embodied themes that resonated across cultures and time. He had confronted division and restored unity, faced uncertainty and forged stability, inherited chaos and created order. In this sense, His legacy transcended national borders and historical eras, offering a universal example of leadership, resilience, and hope. Travelers standing atop the cliffs of Deir el-Bahri at sunset often described a feeling of connection to something larger than themselves. As the sun dipped behind the rugged mountains and shadows lengthened across the terraces, the temple seemed to glow with an inner light, a reflection of its enduring spiritual presence. Many felt that in those quiet moments, surrounded by the echoes of ancient chants carried away by the evening wind, the memory of Mentuhotep II grew almost palpable, as though the king's spirit still lingered within the landscape he had once shaped. In the collective imagination of humanity, his story continued to evolve, woven from the threads of myth, history, archaeology, and personal reflection. It became more than a chronicle of kings and battles. It became a testament to the human capacity for renewal. And as long as people searched the past for wisdom, resilience, and inspiration, the legacy of Mentuhotep II, the king who reunited Egypt, would continue to shine like a beacon across the shifting sands of time, illuminating the path from fragmentation to unity, from despair to rebirth, from silence to a story that refuses to end. In the centuries still unfolding, long after archaeological discoveries had reignited global fascination, the legacy of Mentuhotep II continued to be reinterpreted in the ever-changing context of human understanding. As digital technology advanced, historians and enthusiasts around the world gained unprecedented access to the details of his reign, exploring high-resolution scans of reliefs, virtual tours of his mortuary complex, and meticulously reconstructed models of ancient Thebes. With a simple gesture of hand across a screen, students in distant countries could examine the architecture of Deir el-Bahri or zoom into the minute carvings that once depicted processions of priests and offerings. These digital reconstructions brought the Unifier King into new forms of cultural consciousness, allowing modern audiences to appreciate the intricacy and grandeur of structures that had long weathered the burdens of millennia. Through these technologies, Mentuhotep's story reached individuals who might never stand beneath the towering cliffs of Western Thebes, expanding his influence far beyond the physical boundaries of Egypt. Scholars supplemented these tools with new findings gleaned from satellite imagery that revealed ancient roads, overlooked necropolises, and forgotten quarries associated with his reign. These discoveries illuminated the extensive logistical networks that must have sustained his political and military campaigns, offering concrete evidence of the immense organizational capacity exercised by the king and his administration. As researchers traced these networks, they gained sharper insight into how Mentuhotep's bureaucracy functioned, how supplies flowed between nomes, and how communication was maintained across a land still healing from fragmentation. Modern researchers marveled at the sophistication of these systems, recognizing that Egypt's reunification required far more than battlefield victories alone. It demanded the rebuilding of societal infrastructure capable of supporting stable governance. In this way, the king's administrative genius came into fuller view, underscoring his long-term vision for the two lands. Meanwhile, crowds of travelers from across the globe journeyed to Egypt, drawn by a fascination cultivated over centuries. They wandered through the terraces of Deir el-Bahri, feeling the ancient stones warm beneath the desert sun, and tried to imagine the temple as it once stood, adorned with vibrant colors, bustling with priests, and filled with incense drifting upward into the morning sky. Many stood silently at the edges of the hypostyle hall, feeling a strange and powerful connection to the people who had walked there nearly 4,000 years ago. The spaces between the columns, the wind moving through unseen corridors, the distant call of birds circling the cliffs, all these sensations created a momentary bridge between past and present. Visitors described a kind of reverence that stilled their thoughts, as though the very air carried echoes of ancient prayer. And even those who knew little of Egyptian history found themselves drawn into the story of Mentuhotep II, sensing the weight of meaning embedded in the site. For Egypt itself, the legacy of the Unifier King took on yet another dimension. His memory became part of the dialogue concerning cultural heritage, identity, and preservation in a fast-changing world. Egyptian archaeologists, historians, and conservators, many of whom had grown up hearing stories of ancient kings and gods, felt a personal connection to Mentuhotep II's accomplishments. Their dedication to preserving sites, studying artifacts, and educating the public stemmed from a desire to protect the deep-rooted cultural continuity that the king himself had helped shape. They saw in his story a symbol of national pride, a historical figure who had once restored Egypt at a time of uncertainty. And so, modern Egyptians carried forth his legacy with renewed purpose, working to ensure that future generations would continue to draw inspiration from the vast tapestry of their past. In academic circles, scholars found themselves contemplating broader philosophical questions tied to Mentuhotep's reign. His role in restoring unity raised implications not only for the study of ancient governance, but for the universal patterns by which societies fracture and heal. Researchers compared his strategies to those employed in other civilizations across world history, identifying parallels between his efforts and those of leaders who had confronted similar challenges. In these comparative studies, Mentuhotep emerged not merely as an Egyptian king, but as a global symbol of unification and renewal. His story became a lens through which to examine the cycles of disintegration and restoration that recur throughout human civilization. These academic dialogues enriched the modern understanding of his reign, transforming it from a historical event into a case study in resilience and statecraft. Over time, artistic representations of Mentuhotep II multiplied across various media. Musicians composed orchestral works inspired by the grandeur of his mortuary complex, seeking to translate the immense verticality of the cliffs and terraces into sound. Painters rendered abstract interpretations of the unification, using swirling patterns of color to depict the merging of Upper and Lower Egypt. Digital artists created immersive experiences in which viewers could walk beside ghostly figures reenacting ancient rituals, blending historical accuracy with modern creative innovation. Through these works, the king's legacy expanded into the realm of contemporary culture, inspiring new forms of expression that further preserved his memory. In Egypt's schools, children learned of his deeds through stories tailored to ignite imagination and curiosity. Teachers described how he brought peace to a divided land and built monuments that blended seamlessly with the mountains. Monuments that still stood after thousands of years. These lessons taught not only history, but also the values embedded within the narrative, the importance of perseverance, wisdom, and the pursuit of harmony. Young students, hearing these stories for the first time, often viewed Mentuhotep as a heroic figure whose achievements belonged not only to the ancient world, but to their own heritage. As they grew older and encountered the complexities of Egyptian history, they began to appreciate the deeper significance of his reign, seeing him as a real human being shaped by the challenges of his time. As the decades passed, climate change, tourism, and urban development posed new threats to archaeological sites across Egypt. Winds carried abrasive sand against carved surfaces, flash floods eroded foundations, and human activity placed pressure on the fragile desert environment. In response, conservationists and engineers collaborated to devise innovative solutions, environmental barriers, improved drainage systems, and advanced monitoring technology to protect structures like Mentuhotep's temple. These efforts demonstrated humanity's growing commitment to safeguarding the past, ensuring that the fragile legacy of ancient civilizations would not be lost to the forces of nature or neglect. Across the globe, communities of enthusiasts continued to expand, forming online forums, research groups, and collaborative spaces where individuals exchanged ideas about Mentuhotep II's reign. Amateur historians contributed their own insights, analyzing translations, sharing photographs from their travels, and participating in discussions once accessible only to specialists. This democratization of knowledge enriched the collective understanding of the king's story, fostering a widespread appreciation for the complexity and beauty of ancient Egypt. Conversations spanned continents, connecting people who might never meet in person, but who shared a deep fascination for the unifier king and the civilization he helped rejuvenate. In time, as new archaeological discoveries emerged, an inscription revealing a previously unknown official, a fragment of relief showing a forgotten ritual, a buried structure that expanded the known boundaries of the mortuary complex, the story of Mentuhotep II continued to grow. Each new piece, no matter how small, woven into the fabric of the existing narrative, deepened the world's understanding of his reign. Scholars speculated about the personal dimensions of his life, his relationships, his private fears, his reflections during moments of solitude atop the cliffs overlooking Thebes. Though such questions remained largely unanswerable, they added a layer of humanity to the legend, reminding modern audiences that beneath the grandeur of monuments and the weight of history stood a man shaped by the same emotional complexities that define every human life. And so, as the world advanced further into the digital age, Mentuhotep II's story continued to echo across time, carried by the spoken word, the written record, the chisel marks left in ancient stone, and the digital impressions stored in servers across the globe. His legacy remained a living force, dynamic, evolving, eternal. The king who once restored unity to a fractured land had become a symbol of continuity for all humanity, reminding each generation that even in the midst of turmoil, restoration is possible. His memory, like the Nile that flows unceasingly through the heart of Egypt, endured as a testament to resilience. And as long as people sought meaning in the triumph of order over chaos, Mentuhotep II would remain not only a figure of the past, but a guiding presence for the future. As future generations continued to reinterpret the echoes of antiquity, Mentuhotep II's legacy settled deeper into the global memory, becoming a symbolic crossroads where myth, history, archaeology, and imagination converged. In a world accelerating toward unprecedented technological advancement, the ancient king's story found new relevance, illustrating timeless lessons about rebuilding in fractured times. Scholars from diverse fields, anthropology, psychology, political science, art history, found themselves drawn to his narrative, analyzing it through the lenses of their disciplines to uncover universal truths embedded within his ancient journey. They identified in his reign a model for navigating societal transitions, one that balanced tradition and reform, strength and empathy, visionary ambition, and practical governance. Through their studies, the complexity of his role crystallized further, illuminating how his leadership had shaped Egypt's rebirth, not only politically, but culturally and spiritually. Meanwhile, technology continued to reveal dimensions of his world that had remained hidden for millennia. High-definition 3D scans allowed researchers to reconstruct damaged reliefs with remarkable accuracy, revealing details long lost to erosion, subtle expressions carved on the faces of courtiers, the delicate positioning of offerings held by priests, the intricate patterns etched into ceremonial clothing. These reconstructions offered glimpses into artistic practices during the transitional period between the Old and Middle Kingdoms, demonstrating how artisans pushed boundaries and experimented with forms as the nation regained its footing. Virtual reality experiences allowed users to walk through the mortuary complex as it may have appeared at its zenith. People could hear simulated chants echoing through hypostyle halls, watch torchlight flicker against freshly painted reliefs, and witness reenactments of processions moving across the terraces. For brief moments, the barriers between ages dissolved, enabling modern audiences to experience an emotional resonance with a world that otherwise lay silent beneath layers of dust and time. Academics debated the philosophical implications of such reconstructions. Some argued that they allowed the public to connect more deeply with the ancient past, fostering appreciation and understanding. Others cautioned that digital interpretations, no matter how precise, risked imposing modern assumptions upon ancient realities. Yet even in these debates, Mentuhotep's legacy served as the focal point for discussions that bridged the ancient and contemporary worlds, proving that his story continued to stimulate intellectual curiosity and cultural discourse. In Egypt, the growing movement for heritage preservation gained strength, bolstered by a new generation of researchers, students, and activists who saw in Mentuhotep's reign a symbol of resilience. Restoration projects expanded, drawing on local and international expertise to protect vulnerable sites not only at Deir el-Bahri but across Thebes and beyond. Engineers studied the cliffs surrounding his temple, identifying areas prone to collapse and stabilizing them to prevent future damage. Conservators painstakingly cleaned soot and grime from carved surfaces, revealing vibrant pigments hidden beneath centuries of decay. These acts of preservation extended the life of the ancient monument, allowing it to continue standing as a testament to human endurance. As these efforts progressed, community engagement became a central focus. Residents living near archaeological areas participated in educational programs designed to foster pride in local heritage. They spoke with specialists, observed restoration techniques, and learned the significance of the structures that had been part of their landscape since childhood. Children listened with wide eyes as guides described the battles that once shook the land, the ceremonies that had taken place beneath the desert sun, and the monumental achievements of Mentuhotep II. Many felt a newfound connection to their history, realizing that the story of the Unifier King was in some sense their story too, a legacy woven into the places they called home. Through international collaboration, universities established new research centers dedicated to studying periods of transition in ancient civilizations. Mentuhotep II frequently emerged as a case study, illustrating how societies recover from fragmentation and how leaders navigate the delicate process of restoring coherence. Scholars compared his reign to pivotal moments in the histories of Mesopotamia, China, Mesoamerica, and later European states, finding striking parallels in the rhythms of decline and renewal. These comparative studies broaden the scope of ancient Egyptian history, situating Mentuhotep within a global conversation about human resilience and adaptation. Writers and filmmakers of the modern world continued to draw inspiration from his legacy, crafting stories that portrayed him as a leader of great depth, sometimes stern, sometimes compassionate, always determined in his mission to heal a divided land. Novels imagined the internal conflicts he might have faced, the doubts he may have wrestled with in the quiet hours before dawn, the burden of knowing that the fate of a civilization rested upon his decisions. Films depicted the sweeping drama of his military campaigns, the symbolic weight of his coronation, and the grandeur of his architectural achievements. These creative works rekindled public fascination, breathing new life into the ancient narrative and prompting new generations to explore the world of Old and Middle Kingdom Egypt. Even beyond the realms of scholarship and entertainment, Mentuhotep's story found a place in the personal reflections of individuals navigating their own challenges. People found meaning in the narrative of a leader who restored unity after chaos, drawing parallels to struggles in their own lives, whether recovering from loss, rebuilding fractured relationships, or finding purpose after difficult chapters. The universal themes embedded in the king's story, perseverance, renewal, the pursuit of harmony, resonated deeply in ways that transcended cultural and historical boundaries. Environmental scientists studying the geology of Western Thebes uncovered new insights as well. Analyses of sediment layers revealed fluctuations in climate patterns that may have influenced settlement and agricultural productivity during Mentuhotep's reign. These findings provided context for the socio-economic stresses that fueled regional fragmentation during the First Intermediate Period, strengthening the understanding of the challenges he overcame. By aligning environmental data with archaeological and textual evidence, researchers pieced together a more holistic view of his world, one shaped not only by human ambition, but by the rhythms of nature. As century peeled away from century, and humanity entered new eras defined by technological leaps, global interconnectivity, and shifting political landscapes, Mentuhotep II's legacy proved remarkably adaptable. His story served as a reminder that no civilization is immune to hardship, yet no period of decline is without the possibility of renewal. The Unifier King embodied the idea that with leadership, vision, and collective belief, fractured societies can be rebuilt into something stronger. In this way, his influence stretched far beyond the boundaries of history, touching the imagination of anyone who sought lessons from the past to shape the future. And so it was that the king who once restored Egypt's unity continued to live not only in stone and inscription, not only in museum halls or scholarly debates, but in the hearts of people who found guidance in the example he set. His memory reflected humanity's enduring desire to overcome division, to create stability where there is turmoil, to bring light to places shadowed by uncertainty. As long as such aspirations existed, Mentuhotep II would remain more than a name in ancient annals. He would continue to stand as an eternal symbol of renewal, his legacy flowing forward like the timeless Nile, steady, unwavering, and ever-present. And as the world continued to shift in ways both subtle and monumental, the study of Mentuhotep II evolved alongside it, shaped by fresh questions rising from new generations of seekers who approached the ancient past with perspectives unimagined by earlier scholars. These emerging voices brought with them a desire not merely to collect data, but to understand the emotional and psychological dimensions of antiquity, to uncover the inner workings of lives once lived beneath the desert sun. They sought to know not only what Mentuhotep achieved, but what he felt, what he feared, what dreams he carried in the recesses of his mind. Though emotional landscapes left no inscriptions on stone, researchers employed interdisciplinary methods to approximate the world of sentiments that might have influenced the ruler's actions. They drew upon studies of leadership, psychology, trauma, rebuilding societies, and the impact of prolonged conflict on communities. Through these lenses, they began to reconstruct speculative, yet richly contextualized portraits of how Mentuhotep may have perceived his obligations not as abstract political imperatives, but as burdens he bore for the sake of future generations. Meanwhile, new excavations around lesser-known sites associated with his reign uncovered additional layers of complexity. Work in remote wadis revealed remnants of small way stations, simple stone structures that suggested logistical networks supporting long desert campaigns. These humble ruins offered insight into the operational brilliance behind Mentuhotep's military strategies. He had not merely commanded armies, he had engineered a system capable of sustaining them across harsh terrain, ensuring that his forces moved with precision and adaptability. These findings painted him not just as a warrior, but as a master planner whose foresight underpinned his battlefield successes. Elsewhere, discoveries in Nubia illuminated the delicate diplomacy he maintained along Egypt's southern frontier. Excavated inscriptions revealed exchanges of goods and luxuries, evidence that Mentuhotep's approach was not solely based in conquest, but also in negotiation and cultural exchange. Archaeologists identified pottery styles bearing hybrid influences, suggesting that artisans in border regions blended Egyptian and Nubian techniques to create new forms of expression. These artifacts testified to a dynamic interaction between peoples, revealing that the king's legacy extended beyond military dominance into realms of cultural synthesis. With each new discovery, previously held assumptions shifted, gradually building a more nuanced picture of the era. The previously dominant narrative of a warlike king restoring unity through decisive military action began to merge with stories of a thoughtful administrator, an architectural innovator, a patron of artists, and a ruler acutely aware of the fragility of order. Scholars recognize that the transition from the First Intermediate Period to the Middle Kingdom was not a single event, but a process, a gradual coalescence of identity, stability, and artistic revival, fueled by Mentuhotep's steady guidance. In cities far from Egypt, where the sands of the Nile Valley were distant abstractions, interest in Mentuhotep II nonetheless thrived. Museums hosted exhibitions showcasing newly discovered artifacts, and visitors from around the world gazed at the objects that had accompanied ancient priests, soldiers, and artisans during the king's lifetime. They marveled at the craftsmanship of faience amulets, the precision of carved wooden figures, the quiet solemnity of funerary statues whose eyes seemed to follow them across the room. Curators arranged displays to highlight the contrast between the unrest of the First Intermediate Period and the flourishing cultural renaissance that followed under Mentuhotep's rule. Many left the exhibits with a sense of awe, feeling the weight of centuries collapse into the present moment. Their conversations lingered long after they exited the museum halls, as though the echoes of the ancient past continued to whisper in their thoughts. Educators incorporated the king's story into curricula, exploring the development of early states and the resilience of human societies. Students studied how environmental pressures, economic fluctuations, and political fragmentation had shaped ancient Egypt's internal struggles. They examined the leadership qualities that allowed Mentuhotep to overcome these challenges: his strategic patience, his willingness to adapt, his ability to inspire loyalty among diverse factions. Some students found in these lessons unexpected relevance to their own lives. They saw reflections of modern complexities in the ancient narrative, realizing that the cycles of hardship and renewal that marked Egypt's history repeated themselves in different ways across time and space. Artists continued to reinterpret the king's image in mediums as varied as digital illustration, sculpture, dance, and spoken word. Each artistic expression brought new dimensions to his story, capturing aspects that academic analyses often left untouched. A sculptor might emphasize the stoic determination in the king's gaze, while a poet might dwell on the quiet solitude of leadership. Digital artists could render sweeping reconstructions of his temple, bathing the terraces in vibrant light, or depicting the surrounding cliffs drenched in sunrise gold. These creative interpretations breathed emotional depth into the ancient figure, transforming historical knowledge into visceral experience. In this way, Mentuhotep II became less a distant monarch and more a symbol of universal human striving. Genealogists and family historians, fascinated by the long arc of civilization, sometimes wondered if modern people might carry traces of ancestry reaching back to the citizens of Mentuhotep's Egypt. While genetic continuity could not be mapped with precision across such vast spans of time, the idea itself sparked curiosity, an imagined connection that drew individuals into exploring the cultures and histories of their distant predecessors. Some visited Egypt in person, traveling through Thebes, walking among the ruins, breathing the dry desert air, listening as guides recounted tales of battles fought and monuments built. Others explored digitally through interactive maps and 3D models, tracing ancient streets and temples as though wandering through memory. Everywhere, the experience of encountering Mentuhotep's world fostered a sense of wonder, a reminder that human stories are interwoven across epochs. The religious landscape of Mentuhotep's time continued to intrigue theologians and historians alike. Studies of funerary practices revealed subtle shifts in belief systems, changes in how Egyptians perceived the afterlife, divine kingship, and their relationship with the gods. Inscriptions from the king's temple indicated evolving expressions of devotion, blending traditional motifs with emerging symbols that hinted at deeper philosophical transformations occurring during the transition to the Middle Kingdom. Scholars debated how these shifts reflected changes in societal values, suggesting that the trauma of political fragmentation may have influenced spiritual practices, prompting individuals to seek stability and continuity in new theological expressions. Meanwhile, modern political thinkers found resonance in the story of reunification. They examined how Mentuhotep's strategies for consolidating power balanced authority with respect for provincial traditions. His approach offered insights into managing diversity within a unified state, an enduring challenge faced by nations throughout history. Though the ancient world differed vastly from the present, patterns of governance, negotiation, and conflict resolution revealed surprising parallels, suggesting that wisdom from antiquity could still inform modern discourse. As society progressed into new centuries, and as humanity continued to grapple with uncertainties, political shifts, environmental concerns, technological upheaval, Mentuhotep's story endured as a beacon of continuity. His reign exemplified the notion that decline is not irreversible, that unity can emerge from discord, that structures, whether political, cultural, or personal, can be rebuilt even after being fractured. In every retelling, his legacy expanded, not through embellishment, but through reinterpretation, as each generation found in his narrative the lessons they most needed. The sands of his homeland still shifted around the stones of his mortuary temple, winds whispering across the cliffs of Deir el-Bahri. And though time continued its endless march, eroding monuments and reshaping landscapes, the essence of his story remained untouched. It lived in the minds of those who studied him, in the imaginations of those who dreamed of ancient days, in the collective memory of a world that refused to forget the leader who brought light back to a divided land. In this way, Mentuhotep II transcended the boundaries of mortality and history alike. His legacy persisted in a realm where time could not diminish it, where understanding, curiosity, and reverence ensured that his name would not fade. And as long as people sought meaning in the past, as long as they searched for guidance in the stories left behind, the king who reunited Egypt would continue to walk beside them, an ever-present reminder of humanity's capacity for renewal, unity, and enduring hope. And as the legacy of Mentuhotep II continued to ripple outward across generations, the dialogue surrounding his reign expanded into yet more unexpected territories, weaving itself into disciplines that had once seemed far removed from the study of ancient Egypt. Cognitive scientists, for instance, began to explore how collective memories form and evolve, using Mentuhotep's story as a model for understanding the mechanisms through which societies preserve specific narratives while allowing others to fade. They analyzed how symbols, monuments, and rituals became anchors for shared identity, and how powerful figures like Mentuhotep gained mythic dimensions over time. Their studies suggested that cultural memory was not simply inherited but actively constructed, shaped by the needs and aspirations of those who retold the stories. In this way, the king's image became a lens through which to examine the psychology of remembrance. At the same time, advances in biomolecular archaeology brought new layers to the discussion. Though Mentuhotep's own remains had not been conclusively identified, the remains of individuals from his era yielded insights into health, diet, mobility, and even genetic diversity. Analysis of bone isotopes revealed seasonal patterns of migration among workers who labored on the king's building projects, suggesting a workforce drawn from multiple regions of Egypt. Dental studies showed evidence of improved nutrition during the Middle Kingdom's early years, perhaps reflecting the stabilization of food production and distribution after decades of turmoil. These biological findings grounded the grand narrative of reunification in the lived experiences of ordinary people, reminding scholars that the king's accomplishments were supported by countless individuals whose contributions, though left unnamed, were essential to Egypt's renewal. Meanwhile, the mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahri continued to yield discoveries, large and small. Researchers employing micro-excavation techniques uncovered pigments still clinging to the recesses of carved reliefs, bright ochres, faded greens, traces of Egyptian blue. These remnants suggested that the temple had once been a riot of color, its imagery alive with vibrancy rather than the muted stone surfaces visible today. Digital artists meticulously reconstructed these colors, creating models that allowed viewers to glimpse the temple as it might have appeared during ceremonial processions when the sun illuminated painted walls and rhythmic chants filled the air. Standing before such reconstructions, observers found themselves transported emotionally, experiencing a fleeting sense of presence within an ancient world that would otherwise remain unreachable. The attention given to Mentuhotep's architectural innovations grew as ongoing studies revealed the extent of his influence on subsequent monumental construction. His terraced temple, with its harmonious integration into the natural cliffs of western Thebes, had inspired not only later Egyptian builders, but also architects across cultures and centuries. Students of architecture marveled at the way the structure blended geometry with landscape, creating a visual dialogue between human creativity and natural grandeur. They examined the temple's progression of spaces, analyzing how movement through ramps and colonnades shaped the ritual experience. Some even proposed that Mentuhotep's complex represented one of the earliest instances of psychological architecture design intended to evoke emotional transitions through spatial arrangement. Philosophers and ethicists, too, found fertile ground in the king's story. They explored how narratives of ancient leadership could illuminate enduring questions about power, morality, and responsibility. Was Mentuhotep's decision to wage war against rival factions justified by the unity he ultimately achieved? Did the stability he created outweigh the violence that accompanied its establishment? Scholars debated these points, using his reign as a case study in the ethical complexities of leadership during periods of societal fragmentation. Through such discussions, Mentuhotep became more than a historical figure. He became a touchstone for exploring moral dilemmas that transcended time. In literary circles, Mentuhotep II emerged as a compelling archetype: the reconciler, the restorer, the builder of new worlds from the remnants of the old. Writers found in his story echoes of universal themes: the struggle against chaos, the restoration of balance, the tension between ambition and duty. They reimagined his experiences through metaphor, using his reign as a symbolic framework for narratives ranging from political allegories to explorations of personal transformation. Some wrote from the perspective of courtiers who witnessed his rise, others from the viewpoint of soldiers marching under his command, and others still from the introspective gaze of the king himself, pacing the chambers of his palace in the quiet hours before dawn. These creative works did not seek historical precision but emotional truth, drawing out the timeless humanity within the ancient tale. The continued exploration of Mentuhotep's world also reshaped the way people thought about cultural revival. His era, once defined simply as the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, came to be understood as a profound rebirth, a moment when art, literature, and statecraft evolved in response to collective trauma. Historians analyzed the ways in which cultural expressions of the period reflected the desire for renewed stability. Hymns composed during his reign emphasized divine order and the king's role as a guarantor of harmony. Artistic styles, while honoring traditional forms, introduced innovative elements that subtly redefined aesthetic conventions. Even administrative reforms reflected the aspiration to rebuild trust in institutions that had faltered during the years of division. These developments underscored the creative potential that often arises in the aftermath of crisis, illustrating how societies reinvent themselves through both continuity and transformation. As these insights accumulated, educators began to use Mentuhotep's reign as a model for teaching about resilience, not just in nations, but in communities and individuals. Workshops and seminars emphasized lessons drawn from his leadership: the importance of patience in times of uncertainty, the value of incremental progress, the necessity of balancing strength with compassion. Participants found that the ancient narrative resonated deeply with modern challenges. Whether they were rebuilding after natural disasters, fostering unity in divided communities, or navigating personal upheavals, the story of the king who restored Egypt became a beacon of hope, a reminder that fragmentation need not be the final chapter. In Egypt itself, the spiritual significance of Mentuhotep's legacy found quiet expression in local communities living in the shadow of the Theban cliffs. Though modern religious practices differed entirely from those of ancient times, some residents felt a sense of guardianship over the landscape, viewing themselves as stewards of the history embedded in the stones. They spoke with reverence about the beauty of the cliffs at sunset, when the fading light cast golden hues upon the terraces of the temple, creating a momentary illusion of the ancient past coming alive. For many, the site became a place of reflection, a reminder of both the endurance of history and the fleeting nature of human life. In this environment, time seemed to stretch infinitely, binding the present to the distant past in ways that defied linear explanation. Through global collaboration, digital archives continued to expand, ensuring that Mentuhotep's legacy would remain accessible to people around the world for generations to come. High-resolution scans of inscriptions, transcriptions of ancient texts, photographs of artifacts, and detailed site maps allowed scholars to conduct research remotely, fostering an international network of knowledge exchange. Students from distant countries could study the intricacies of hieroglyphic inscriptions or trace the layout of the mortuary complex without ever setting foot in Egypt. This democratization of access reshaped the field, inviting new perspectives that enriched the collective understanding of the ancient world. And still, despite all the progress, all the technology, all the innovation, the heart of Mentuhotep's legacy remained rooted in the same simple truth that had echoed across the sands for millennia: that the act of bringing people together, of mending divisions and restoring balance, is among the most profound endeavors any leader or any individual can undertake. His life illustrated the enduring principle that unity, though often hard-won, forms the foundation upon which civilizations thrive. His achievements demonstrated that even after periods of darkness, renewal is possible. His story proved that the past, far from being a distant and irrelevant realm, holds lessons that continue to illuminate the path forward. And so, as long as humanity sought wisdom in the tales of those who came before, as long as people turned to history for guidance in their moments of uncertainty, Mentuhotep II, the king who reunited Egypt, would endure. His name would live on, not only in carved stone or scholarly texts, but in the shared human longing for harmony, strength, and the restoration of what has been broken. His legacy would remain a steady flame, illuminating the long corridor of time with its unwavering glow, guiding all who sought inspiration in the triumphs and trials of those who shaped the ancient world. And still the story flowed onward, carried by the inexhaustible curiosity of those who refused to let the ancient world fall silent, and by the stubborn endurance of the stones that bore witness to the rise, the struggles, and the triumphs of Mentuhotep II. As scholarship widened further, new questions emerged, questions reaching beyond the conventional boundaries of archaeology into realms entwined with the essence of human civilization itself. Linguists, for example, delved deeper into the evolution of written language during the king's reign. They examined how hieroglyphic forms subtly shifted, how scribes experimented with new conventions, and how administrative vocabulary adapted to reflect the political unification of the country. These linguistic adjustments revealed more than just stylistic variation. They indicated shifts in collective consciousness, changes in how Egyptians understood authority, identity, and community. The very words written onto papyri and carved onto limestone testified to the psychological transformation of a people moving from fragmentation toward cohesion. At the same time, environmental historians studied how the reunified state managed natural resources in the wake of conflict. They analyzed irrigation systems, flood records, and agricultural data preserved in sediment layers along the Nile Valley. Their findings suggested that Mentuhotep's administration not only reconstructed political unity, but also revitalized the infrastructure necessary for sustainable prosperity. Canals were repaired, fields were redistributed, and tax systems were reorganized to promote equity and stability. These efforts helped restore the agrarian backbone of the nation, ensuring that the physical nourishment of the people kept pace with their renewed cultural and political revitalization. The deeper scholars explored, the more they realized how intertwined the king's achievements were with the fabric of daily life. The monumental acts of reunification and temple construction were impressive, but the quieter reforms, those that touched the fields, the workshops, the marketplaces, were equally essential in binding the nation back together. Through recovered administrative documents, researchers reconstructed scenes of local governors working alongside royal officials to harmonize regional policies, demonstrating that the restoration of Egypt was a collaborative enterprise, not solely the work of a single leader. Meanwhile, artisans and craftspeople of the modern world continued to find inspiration in the aesthetic principles of Mentuhotep's era. Jewelry designers studied the symmetrical forms and symbolic motifs of Middle Kingdom ornaments, incorporating ancient themes into contemporary pieces. Ceramic artists experimented with the earthy tones and balanced shapes characteristic of early Middle Kingdom pottery, discovering in those ancient designs a timeless appeal. Even architects turned to the king's terrace temple as a source of inspiration, incorporating elements of its layered geometry into modern structures. Some buildings echoed the clean lines and natural integration of the Deir el-Bahari complex, creating spaces that honored antiquity while embracing modern needs. In these creative fields, Mentuhotep's legacy lived not as a static historical fact, but as a dynamic force shaping present-day expression. The scientific community, too, continued to push boundaries. Advances in remote sensing technology revealed hidden features beneath the desert surface. Subterranean chambers, buried fragments of walls, traces of ancient footpaths. Each discovery raised new questions about the logistics of temple construction, the movement of people and goods, and the ritual functions of spaces long lost to the shifting sands. Archaeologists mapped these features with meticulous care, adding fine details to an ever-growing portrait of the king's era. As technology improved, researchers grew increasingly hopeful that one day, definitive traces of Mentuhotep's burial, if it lay hidden somewhere beyond the known structures, might finally be discovered. The prospect stirred both excitement and caution, for such a discovery would be monumental, but could also challenge established understandings of the king's mortuary landscape. Historians of religion broadened their focus to examine how the spiritual symbolism of Mentuhotep's reign resonated with changing beliefs across centuries of Egyptian history. The king's portrayal as a divine figure, often shown in the traditional regalia of the god Osiris, reflected not only political propaganda, but also an evolving belief in the king's role as a mediator between the mortal world and the divine. This imagery influenced later conceptions of kingship, contributing to the ideological foundations of the Middle Kingdom and the spiritual framework that sustained Egyptian civilization for centuries. Through this lens, Mentuhotep was not merely a political unifier, but a spiritual anchor, whose divine associations helped restore a sense of cosmic order disrupted by decades of unrest. As interpretive frameworks deepened, scholars increasingly recognized that the king's achievements could not be understood solely through political or military narratives. His legacy encompassed emotional, philosophical, psychological, and spiritual dimensions that shaped the collective identity of his people. His reign was a turning point, not only in historical terms, but in the more intangible realms of meaning-making and cultural resilience. These broader insights led some researchers to view Mentuhotep's unification of Egypt as a symbolic act extending far beyond the immediate political landscape. They saw in his reign a story of healing, a narrative about overcoming fragmentation, forging unity, and cultivating a renewed sense of shared destiny. This interpretation resonated particularly in times of modern upheaval, when societies around the world grappled with division and uncertainty. In many corners of the globe, Mentuhotep's story found unexpected meaning in classrooms, community centers, and public forums, where people explored the challenges of building cohesion within diverse or fractured communities. His reign offered a lens through which to examine the complexities of reconciliation, the responsibilities of leadership, and the potential for renewal after hardship. The fact that such lessons emerged from events separated from the present by nearly 4 millennia only reinforced the universality of the themes embodied in his life. And as these ideas permeated public discourse, the ancient king gained renewed relevance. The past flowed into the present in subtle but profound ways, shaping conversations about governance, identity, and the power of shared narratives to bind societies together. In Egypt, heritage tourism continued to thrive, drawing visitors from across the world to the footsteps of Mentuhotep's monuments. Travelers stood in awe at the base of the cliffs, gazing up at the terraces of Deir el-Bahari, imagining the processions that had once climbed the ramps and filled the courtyards with ritual energy. They wandered through partially collapsed chambers, their footsteps echoing softly against stone walls, still bearing faint traces of paint. Some were struck by the overwhelming sense of connection to those who had lived thousands of years before. Others felt humbled by the sheer endurance of the structures, which had outlasted countless generations. Many left the site with a renewed appreciation not only for the grandeur of ancient Egypt, but for the enduring human desire to create, to commemorate, and to leave behind something that transcends one's lifespan. In academic circles, discussions about cultural memory continued to evolve, exploring how societies choose to remember certain figures while allowing others to fade. Mentuhotep II's persistence in historical consciousness illustrated the interplay between symbolic significance, monumental presence, and narrative necessity. He had become a fixed point in the collective imagination, representing a moment when hope triumphed over despair, when coherence emerged from disarray. The image of the unifier king thus remained woven into the broader tapestry of human history, a thread that endured through countless reinterpretations. And beyond the halls of scholarship, beyond the artistic and scientific endeavors, beyond the global networks of museums and cultural institutions, Mentuhotep's story continued to live in quieter, more intimate ways. It lived in the fascination of a child reading about ancient Egypt for the first time, imagining the desert dunes and the echoing halls of temples. It lived in the determination of a student studying leadership, drawing parallels between the ancient king's perseverance and their own aspirations. It lived in the reflections of those who sought inspiration during times of personal struggle, finding in his narrative a reminder that rebuilding after hardship is not only possible, but deeply transformative. In these moments, the king's legacy transcended the realm of historical knowledge, settling instead into the realm of personal meaning, an enduring testament to the power of stories to nourish the human spirit. And so the tale continued, carried forward by voices across the world, each adding nuance, each drawing new connections, each breathing fresh life into the name of Mentuhotep II. The king who reunited Egypt remained, across millennia, a symbol of resilience, continuity, and the enduring human capacity to rebuild, reimagine, and renew. His legacy, like the Nile itself, flowed onward without end, a river of memory winding through the landscape of time, nourishing minds and hearts wherever its waters reached.